to have you here today. As a fellow clinician who loves mindfulness, I suspect it's because each of us as clinicians has really seen the power of how presence and non-judgment can support our well-being and our clients' well-being. And we want more. We're here because we want more. We want more of how does this show up with depression, anxiety, trauma. What's the latest research? Why does it matter to our clinical practice? And what are the most effective and practical tools we can use in sessions with clients? So you're going to get all of that and so much more. We are thrilled to have you here today. A few housekeeping things. If you haven't already done so, please check out the FAQ section in your portal. Our team spends a lot of time addressing the most commonly asked questions, so you'll have all the answers you need throughout the training. We will have a mid-morning break followed by some Q&A. Lunch is at 12:50 Central Time to 2 Central Time. And then we will have some Q&A when we come back from lunch. And then mid-afternoon, there will be another 15-minute break. And the day ends at 5 p.m. Central. We have a lot of you who've already taken advantage of the CE and certification upgrade. So you can enjoy this training for free. There are no strings attached. And if you want to get your CEs, up to 12 CEs, as well as take advantage of the eligibility to become a certified mindfulness-informed practitioner after your completion of this course, you can get all of that for just under $100, $99.99. So please take advantage of those upgrades if that interests you. Lastly, we really encourage you to ask questions. So there's a Q&A section of your screen, and you can drop questions throughout the whole day at any time. I will be collecting and sorting those questions, and during the breaks, I will try and get to as many as I can with the speaker. So without further ado, let's dive in. We have an amazing speaker for this event. He is a licensed psychologist in Cincinnati, Ohio, board certified in clinical psychology by the American Board of Professional Psychology, runs a private practice, psychology and consultation practice, and is the director of the Center for Clinical Mindfulness and Meditation. He has run hundreds of mindfulness groups and was a lead clinician in the first brain scan study involving mindfulness with children and adolescents. He is an adjunct professor in the University of Cincinnati Psychology Department, clinical and research faculty at the UC Center for Integrative Health and Wellness, volunteer professor of psychiatry and behavioral neurosciences at the UC College of Medicine, and a former research psychologist contractor with the Cincinnati VA Medical Center. He has written lots of books on mindfulness. Some of the most recent ones include ACT with Anxiety, the ACT Flip Chart, Mindfulness, Living Through Challenges and Enriching Your Life in This Moment, and mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for PTSD. Some interesting facts. He is a 6th degree black belt in Jiu-Jitsu and once served as a personal protection agent for the Dalai Lama with his teacher, Stephen Hayes. And he has studied Eastern wisdom for over 40 years, receiving ordination in 3 traditions and transmission as a Zen master. Please welcome everyone, the amazing Dr. Richard Sears.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Baggs. Boy, makes me look good on paper anyway. But I'm so excited to be able to share this with you today. I've been doing this since I was a teenager. And in fact, this probably all goes back to when I wanted to become a ninja. And it turns out that I did find the Stephen K. Hayes, the man that went to Japan in the 1970s and studied with the last living ninja grandmaster. And he's still my good friend today. He's 74 years old now. But getting involved in martial arts, it turns out, no, it's really about inner conflict. It's really looking at your own mind. And so that's how I got involved in the meditative traditions. And once I did that, I was fascinated, but I couldn't really make a living teaching martial arts or teaching traditional types of meditation. And so eventually I found my way into clinical psychology and was just fascinated. Here now with brain scans and with clinical research, we can start to really tease apart what is it that's helping people? What's really going on here? Now, some of you might think that takes away the mystery of just practicing, and there's something to be said for that. But my passion has been how do we really make this practical and useful to the clients suffering in front of us? I think I mentioned this in the introductory talk about what I'm going to be doing here. I had so many teachers at first. I had some good practical teachers too, but I had some teachers that just had this attitude of just sit there for 20 years and it's all going to come to you. We're not going to talk about it. We don't explain it. And, there's some value to that in the right context and the right cultural milieu. But meanwhile, here's a client right in front of you paying you money and they're suffering. So, how can we have some practical tools? Now, one thing I want to mention right away is I'm not here to sell this actually to you or definitely not to our clients. And we're going to talk about that in just a moment. I just consider this another tool. And, for that matter, how is paying attention not going to be an important tool if you want to make a change in your life or work with your suffering? But how we teach that, what we do with that, that's going to make all the difference. So that's my passion, is how do we put this in a concrete, usable term? So that's my goal for you in the next couple of days, whether this is brand new to you or whether you've been doing this for 40 years. Hopefully you can find some new perspectives, new techniques, new ways of helping people. And the wonderful thing, as you probably already know, is that when we practice mindfulness as clinicians, it helps us as well as helps our clients. So that's a nice bonus. So let me pull up the PowerPoints here. And we're going to dive in. Another thing that I'm really going to be emphasizing here as we go along is the importance of using mindfulness as a way to move into our experiences. And this is so important. I'm gonna mention this now, even though I'm going to talk a lot more about this later on. It's just so important. What can happen is people end up using mindfulness as a distraction. So we're going to talk about this, as I said, in great detail coming up, but we just want to watch out for this. What can happen is, here's our client suffering in front of us. We don't like to see people suffering. So we do a technique to make them feel better. Now, sometimes that's a good thing, but if that's your go-to automatic pattern, what you might accidentally be doing is reinforcing avoidance. In other words, you may be accidentally telling the client, yeah, that feeling you're having, we got to get rid of that. Oh, those thoughts, we got to battle with those. We got to run away from those uncomfortable body sensations. So let's do this technique. And in that moment, maybe they feel better, but then they walk out the door and life happens and they don't know what to do with the emotions, the thoughts, the sensations. So we're going to talk about mindfulness as a kind of exposure therapy. Can I sort of move into what's happening right now and learn to relate differently to what's happening? Now, sometimes that means I feel better, sometimes maybe not, but I'd rather go in it with eyes wide open, paying attention. So that's one of the themes I couldn't resist mentioning even before we get started here. So with that, let's dive right in. And let me get the disclaimer stuff out of the way here. First of all, this should be a given, but I'm guessing there's a broad variety of people watching right now. I know even some of my friends said they were signing up that are not mental health professionals. So the scope of practice slide just basically says, don't do anything you're not licensed to do. I would hope that's a given. We may be talking about all kinds of different clinical approaches and things, but obviously pay attention to what your scope of practice is. Also standard is conflict of interest disclosure. I don't work for any drug companies. I'm not going to try to sell you any medical devices. Probably the closest thing is if you have bought one of my books, I might make 50 cents off of you, and then I'd have to share that with my co-author. So books are not as big a seller as they used to be in the digital age. They're more labors of love. The other thing is I do have some self-paced mindfulness courses on my website, but I'm not here to push that on you. So that's really about it in terms of conflicts of interest. I do want to mention this informed consent piece because, as you probably already know, if you want to do mindfulness with clients, it's important for you to experience this yourself and model it yourself, right? This is not like some other interventions where I'm sort of doing it to somebody else. You don't want to tell a client, yeah, sit with that feeling, it'll be okay. You want to model the ability to be with your own experiences as well. So it's important for us to practice mindfulness to some degree. So we're going to be doing some practices in this course. Um, Now, we're not going to do as much as we would like to. We've got limited time. It would be great if we practiced the whole time, but then I feel like you might not get as much of the clinical piece. So that's what I really want to get to. But all that to say is when we do a mindfulness experience together here, you decide if you're ready for that. Maybe you're just not in the right place today. Maybe you'd rather work on it another time. It's your choice. And so the disclosure is you're not required to participate at any time. You may withdraw from any activity anytime and still receive credit for this program or whatever. But I hope you'll jump in so you can actually experience some of this yourself if you haven't already. And even if you've been practicing all your life, there's always, this moment, always something new to notice and learn. Now, when I'm doing this with smaller groups, I like to go around the room and get a sense of where people are coming from. But with the thousands we have today, that would take the rest of the 2 days. So feel free, though. My email's at the end of the slides, or you can just Google me if you want to just shoot me an email and introduce yourself or have any questions at some point that I don't get a chance to get to. Feel free. So before we dive into what mindfulness is, and maybe I'll just give you a big picture here, by the way. Uh, Most of today may be really getting some foundational stuff. Now, again, even if you have lots of experience, I hope you'll find some subtleties in what I'm talking about here. But we're going to talk about what mindfulness is, introducing it to clients, how and why it works, so that's not some big mystery. I mean, there's still plenty of mystery in life, but we're going to get at clinically why this is so useful and how we can fit it in with what we already know in terms of our clinical knowledge. And then we'll be in a great position for tomorrow to really get nitty gritty in terms of using this with clients. So I'm not going to leave you hanging with just kind of keep practicing and then here's somebody with a panic attack. Good luck. We're going to say, okay, what if somebody comes to you and they have a panic attack? What if they're struggling with OCD? I'm going to give you some very concrete suggestions. Obviously, by the way, I'm assuming you already have some training in how to deal with those things. That's very important. Don't think, okay, I've learned mindfulness. Now I'm going to treat all these different things. Obviously, you want to have training in that. Uh, I still remember, I guess this was years ago, but I was on this LinkedIn group and somehow I got in on this psychotherapy listserv or something. And I just randomly opened it up one day and somebody asked the question, hey, I've got a client with schizophrenia. I've never treated schizophrenia before. Any tips? And I'm like, oh my gosh, yeah, here's a tip. Don't treat that client. You need to have training in whatever it is that you're dealing with. We're going to be adding mindfulness as a tool. Uh, that should be obvious, but I want to make sure that's clear to everyone. And I do, by the way, appreciate the little emojis you're sending up. It gives me some feedback to know that people are listening in here, and I do appreciate the feedback. So what I want to start off with, and then we're going to go into a definition of mindfulness that we can work with. When you're introducing mindfulness to clients, as I mentioned right away, I never force mindfulness on anyone. I mean, even though that's often what I'm known for, if somebody comes to me and says, yeah, I'm struggling with something, I don't say, well, have you tried extra strength mindfulness, right? That's not what I'm here for. My goal is to meet them where they are, figure out where they want to be, and find out what's getting in the way. Now, as I said, paying attention is really all mindfulness is, and that's a skill everyone I think can benefit from, but how you teach it, or what they may need or when and how, all of that, depends on the client. And as you know, sometimes it can backfire anytime you try to force something on someone. And so sometimes even the language you use can be helpful. So just to be able to say, I'd like to invite you to try an experiment. For example, we've been sitting here talking back and forth about what you've been doing, all the background stuff you've tried, you've been thinking about your past, and that doesn't seem to work. We've been doing a lot of thinking. Would you be willing to try something completely different? And most of the time, my clients will say, yeah, that's why I'm here. I want to try something different. In fact, this gets into acceptance and commitment therapy, a term called creative hopelessness, where you try to help the client see you've been doing this a long time and it's not helping. So let's be willing and open to try something different, try something new. Now, it can be scary for some people that are very much in their head to try this different view. And again, a lot of people have some preconceptions. Now, I think this is really changing in modern times. But when I had a martial arts school, we also had meditation classes. And I'm going to talk about the difference, by the way, between the general term meditation and what we mean by mindfulness, of course. But I'll never forget someone that came in and they were watching the classes and they said, wow, this is great. I really want to sign up and learn from you, but I don't want to do any meditation. I said, oh, well, those are just optional classes. Nobody has to come to those. But what we do is we practice being more present in our lives. We practice paying attention to what our minds are doing. We practice watching the patterns of our emotional responses. Other classes, we visualize what we want to become and practice firming up our intention. And this guy goes, wow, all that sounds awesome. I just don't want to do any meditation. Right. So again, sometimes for religious reasons or misconceptions or misunderstandings. In fact, I went to a friend's place in Boston once. And I said, hey, while I'm here in town, I'd be happy to do a mindfulness workshop for you. And he goes, no, no, no. We tried to do that once and we got put on the cult watch list. So again, all that to say, pay attention, which is really getting into the second point I want to make here. Pay attention to diversity variables. Where's this person coming from? What's valuable to them? For a lot of people, prayer is very important to them. And so this may fit in with that. I think it was Freud that really divorced spirituality from psychology. I mean, a lot of people have, but let's make this a science. We don't want to be associated with that. And I understand where they were coming from with that, but the research shows that spirituality is hugely important to a lot of people. So if we just pretend that doesn't exist, we're kind of ignoring a huge part of people's backgrounds and what's important to them. So we always need to pay attention to that, of course. And we're going to talk a whole lot more about diversity issues, well, throughout the workshop, but definitely we'll focus on it tomorrow. Things like resources available to them. Are they even able to perform these exercises when they're busy just trying to make a living, get through the day? So we may need to make modifications for that. Another piece, of course, as pretty much with everything, is let them know they can stop anytime, so you're deciding, I don't like what's coming up. Now, this is a delicate thing when we get into exposure therapy, because stopping in the middle is not the best thing sometimes, but on the other hand, having some experience and some control, our sense of control, can be important. So we're going to talk more about that. But what I mean here is, no, you have to continue. That's not the attitude. You want them to let them know what this is about and what they're doing. And when they know they can stop anytime, they're usually more likely going to be willing to continue and investigate what's going on. And kind of the thing I get at with clients is, whatever you're dealing with, it's already here anyway. So let's see if we can learn something from it, relate to it differently, work with it differently. Another thing, of course, that's important is to use plain language. So be careful about talking about metta or anatta or all these things that people can get caught up in. And the research about the insula or whatever. I just talk about mindfulness as being paying attention. That's really what it is. And you're going to find your own language. You're going to find language that fits the client population you serve, checking in with yourself. Let's see what's going on. Let's just pause for a moment. There's all kinds of ways you can describe it. Interventions like acceptance and commitment therapy have a lot of great metaphors. In fact, I think there was a book out called The Big Book of Act Metaphors or something like that. So there's all these ways you can talk about it with picturesque language that may help people get these concepts more often. I'm going to be sharing a lot of those with you today. I have to be careful with this because if you try to act like you know this language, but you're not really part of that culture, obviously that can backfire. But when I was doing research with mindfulness in the Veterans Hospital, sometimes I would describe mindfulness as, doing a recon on your own body. Let's just kind of check out what's happening right now. When we talk about thoughts that are going on, instead of arguing with them, we can just say, well, notice what movie's playing in your mind right now, just so you're going to find these different things, and we're going to talk about these as we go along. All right, with that, let's dive into a definition of mindfulness. Now, there are lots and lots of definitions of mindfulness. Some of them are extremely boring, but it's important to try because, especially for researchers, we have to try to operationalize the definition of mindfulness so we can know what we're studying, so we can repeat the experiments, so we can make sure we're all looking at the same kinds of things. But what I find most useful personally, or I should just say the one I like the best, comes from Jon Kabat-Zinn. Now, you probably are all familiar with Jon Kabat-Zinn. I thought he retired years ago, but I keep seeing him pop up in different places. And a couple of his friends I got to meet in Atlanta. This was exciting. Just a couple of weeks ago, I got to go to the CDC and give a presentation as part of a conference on mindfulness. And I know all those workers could definitely use some mindfulness. But as you know, Jon Kabat-Zinn was one of the first to really try to operationalize this and systematize a method of training in mindfulness. Now, obviously, it's been around for thousands of years, but I just really liked what he ended up with, and his colleagues at the University of Massachusetts Medical Center. Was an 8-week program called Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction. And we're going to talk about that later on, but it was sort of one of the key pieces of research and clinical interventions that ended up really sparking a whole lot more research. Now, actually, Jon Kabat-Zinn's not a therapist. I think he'd make a fantastic therapist, but his training is in molecular biology, interestingly enough. But certainly anything that he's done, I highly recommend. So this is his definition. And what I'd like to do is, instead of just reading it and moving on, is really break it apart line by line. What are we really getting at when we're talking about mindfulness? And as you'll see, Jon Kabat-Zinn's very practical as well as inspiring, and that's not always an easy combination to have both of those qualities. So the top line of this definition is the awareness that emerges. So this is getting at what we call a waking up quality that has to do with mindfulness. Because a lot of us tend to go through life almost sleepwalking, almost as if we're on automatic pilot. In fact, sometimes it's a literal automatic pilot. You ever been driving your car, and then the next thing you know, you're home, but you don't remember the drive or how you got there, and yet you must have stopped at the stoplights or you'd be dead, but you just kind of did it automatically, right? Now, that's not always a bad thing, but sometimes we do things automatically and don't realize it, right? I still remember years ago, I was driving a friend home and we got in such a deep conversation that the next thing I knew, I pulled into my own driveway and I'm like, oh, wait a minute, you don't live here. I got to turn around and take you home, right? So what we want to do is be able to notice, to wake up to what's happening right now. In fact, my guess is, we've only been doing this for a few minutes basically, but I'll bet you almost everyone here at some point was like, hey, when do they say those breaks were again? Gee, what should I do for lunch? Maybe I should have that. Well, but no. Oh, shoot, I forgot to call that client back. Maybe I should do that. And then suddenly your awareness emerges and you realize, oh, wait a minute, I'm attending a mindfulness workshop right now. just waking up to what's happening right here in front of you. That's that emerging awareness. Now, what's really interesting to me is that this both enriches our moments as well as helps us deal with challenges. Right. So when we live in our minds, it's a pretty flat world. I mean, some of us can have some pretty creative imaginations, but when you really pay attention in this moment, it's such a richer experience because you're experiencing things through your senses. And so mindfulness helps us be more present with the people we care about and notice the things going on around us. So there's a richness that happens with it. But we can also use it in clinical terms to deal with problems, because if we're able to notice these automatic pilot modes of thinking, these automatic pilot modes of emotionally reacting, and these automatic pilot modes of behaviors, we can step back from them and start to recognize, is this helpful to me or not? All right. So you might have a client in your office that basically says, I'm just so lonely. And you say, well, why don't you get out and meet some people? Well, people are stupid, right? So they have this automatic thought and this automatic emotional reaction and this automatic behavior that contributes some to that loneliness. Now, here's the thing: in the past, maybe those things were helpful. I've been in bad relationships. I had a horrible family growing up. I had to push back, set limits, put up walls. Or maybe at work, I've got to do that. But I'm doing it so automatically, I don't recognize that it may not be helpful in this moment. So that's part of the waking up process. What is actually happening in this moment? And is it helpful or not? Now, it could be, yeah, I just want to be automatic right now. I just want to zone out right now. But even that's a choice versus doing it automatically without realizing it. Now, how do we do that? It's through paying attention. And as I mentioned earlier, that's really a good definition of mindfulness all by itself. You don't have to believe anything I tell you, and the research out there is out there. If you just pay attention, you're going to notice all these things I'm talking about these next couple of days. Because if you just pay attention, you'll see how the mind works and what these patterns are I'm talking about. So mindfulness is a lot more than this, but one of the things we're doing is we're exercising our attentional capacity, right? So as I said, you're sitting here and then your mind wanders off. Oh, bring it back to what's in front of you. Well, then your mind wanders off again and you bring it back. Mind wanders off, you bring it back. Mind wanders off, you bring it back. The more you do that, the more you're exercising the attentional channels of your brain. So regular practice helps you actually strengthen certain channels in your brain. And in fact, we're going to talk about this later on. This is called self-directed neuroplasticity. I still remember, and maybe this is dating me, but when I was an undergrad, we were basically told, yeah, by the time you're age 5, your brain's pretty fixed. And now we realize, of course, the brain is always growing, changing, adapting. Otherwise, you couldn't learn or remember anything. Every time you hear something and remember it, have an experience and remember it, you've changed part of your brain. That's how you can remember it. We just weren't sure about the degree that happens, and that's still, being researched. But that's exciting to me. And, the real takeaway here, by the way, is that you become what you expose your mind to. In other words, what you do with your mind is what you become. And this is a little bit of an aside, but I think it's really important. If you spend all day long fixing people's problems, you come home and you got to fix all the problems at home and with your kids and partner or whatever. And then you watch movies about people fixing problems. You're going to dream all night about fixing problems, and your mind's just going to be a problem solving machine. And that's okay. But is that what you always want to be, right? I think it's important to set aside time every day, whether it's to practice formal mindfulness, whether it's to read an uplifting book, whether it's to walk your dogs, sit outside, whatever it might be. But you can consciously shape how you want your mind to be by what you're exposing it to and what you're doing with it. So, it's good news and bad news because it can work against you as well as work for you. Now, here I thought it'd be interesting to add in some things about attention. Now, these are older things, but these were some of the first to really look at what kinds of attention are there. And I came across this when I was teaching a course on neuropsychology years ago, and I thought, this would be important to add into discussions on mindfulness because it's so much about attention, and people loosely use the word attention. Right? If you have a client come to you and say, "Yeah, I have attention problems," especially if you're a neuropsychologist and you have to figure out what in the heck they're talking about, there are a lot of different kinds of attention, so you have to tease that apart. Now, the thing I want to emphasize in this top list is the word arousal. And here we don't necessarily mean sexual arousal, although we're going to talk about mindful sex tomorrow. What I'm wanting to emphasize here is that there's a little bit of an arousal component to attention. It takes a little bit of energy. Now, I don't mean muscular strain, but it takes a little bit of energy to pay attention. That's why caffeine stimulates our brains and we can pay attention a little bit better. But I want to say that because sometimes people get this attitude of I have to constantly pay attention always, and they're sort of what I would call militants for mindfulness. Now, of course, you can do mindfulness in a very open way, but just watch out for this attitude of forcing this all the time. My Zen teacher, and both of them have actually passed away now. His name was Sung San, and when he first came over, I believe it was in the 70s, he didn't speak much English at all. So he would speak in these broken phrases and say, "When sitting, just sit. When eating, just eat." So one day, somebody came into the Zen center, and here's this great Zen teacher reading the newspaper and eating his breakfast at the same time. And so the student says, "Great Zen master, you've always told us when eating, just eat, but here you are eating and reading the newspaper." And without skipping a beat, Sung San said, "Oh, when eating and reading the newspaper, just eat and read the newspaper," right? So don't go overboard with this stuff. Now, the thing we really do want to get at is when I say it takes some energy, I don't mean forced. It's very interesting. One of the things you'll find, if you haven't already, is sometimes you're sitting here doing nothing, but your body acts like it's getting ready to fight or run or do something with all this tension. And this tension has nothing to do with paying attention, right? So we're going to work on noticing all this unnecessary tension that we tend to hold. I wanted to talk more about the second list, though, of these different kinds of attention. What's interesting to me is mindfulness exercises all 5 of these different kinds of attention. So I just thought it'd be worth mentioning these. First of all, there's focused attention. That's where I put my attention where I want it to be, where I focus on something, right? Now, this, by the way, can be divided further into what we might call a spotlight kind of attention or a floodlight kind of attention. So both broad and narrow attention, right? So if I'm focusing on something very narrowly, I really want to read the writing on the pen here. So I'm taking a close focus, narrow view. But when I'm driving a car, not a good idea to be so focused on the little bit in front of me that I miss the context of everything that's happening, right? We all see people driving that way. You have to have a broad attention. And that's a skill. You do want to actually develop that broader focus. Now, just because you can focus doesn't mean you can sustain your attention. As we know, that's a different brain pathway, and people with ADHD have more trouble with sustained attention. And it looks like well, there are different brain pathways that we don't have to get involved in right now, but that ability to keep your attention where you want it to is a skill that you can develop. Now, the next one is selective selective attention, and that's where I put my attention where I want it to be, but I have to ignore all the other things that could be getting my attention. Um, I remember there was a room once where I would regularly teach mindfulness classes, and there was one of those really old-fashioned, loud ticking clocks on the wall. So people be sitting there in silence sometimes, and all of a sudden you'd hear, ch, 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 and it sounded just that loud, right? Now, this may sound a little cruel, but I purposefully left that clock in there because it was always very interesting when we process the exercise, what people would say. And we're going to talk about how to process these exercises. That's very important, the processing part. I'd say, well, what did people notice? And some people would say, oh, that clock was driving me crazy. I just wanted to rip it off the wall, right? But the next person might say, oh, I didn't even notice there was a clock in here. But what most people will say is, I noticed it and then I didn't notice it. And then I noticed it and then I didn't notice it. Isn't that interesting? And so it's a really good lesson in selective attention, right? Because that ticking is just a sound, but then I have a thought about that sound. What an inconsiderate host we have here. Then there's a emotional reaction to that sound, and then maybe even a physiological reaction to that sound. And you can learn how all those affect each other. And in fact, as we'll talk about, it may not be ideal to have complete silence when you practice mindfulness. Obviously, the ultimate goal is to bring it into your life all the time. But the real world's going to have some distractions, so it's good to practice with that. The next one is alternating attention. And that's where you're, shifting around doing different things, right? So you might have to listen to me for a moment, then you write something down, and then you look over at the PowerPoints, and then, your phone goes off, so you silence that. And so you're kind of alternating between different things. Usually there's a good coherence to it, but there's a skill in being able to do that. The last one is also an important skill, but most of us probably do too much of this already, right? So when you're driving your car and you're trying to drink your coffee and you're texting with your elbow and changing the radio with your foot all at the same time. Now, there is a good reason to practice that, right? When you're driving, you really do have to have good divided attention. And I've got my pilot's license. So, when you're flying an airplane, there's a lot of stuff going on, paying attention to the airspeed and the altitude, and somebody's next to you might be saying, what does this button do? And you say, don't touch that. And, traffic out there, there's all this stuff going on. So it is a skill to be able to notice all that and not get lost in it and stay focused on what's important. But in general, by the way, the research has shown that it's not the best way to get things done if you have a choice in the matter. I remember when I got my MBA, it wasn't my class, but one of my colleagues said their class did this. The professor got out a bunch of different tasks and gave them out to each student. Half the room were told, okay, I want you to try to do all of these at the same time as fast as you can. The other side of the room, he said, I want you to do all these things one at a time. Just do all of the first thing first, and then all the next thing, and then all the next thing, and see if you can get it all done as fast as you can. And the people that did it one at a time actually finished in half the amount of time as the people who were trying to do it all at the same time. And as you know, part of the reason is here I am doing this task, but now I've got to change my mindset and shift to do a different task. And then I'm trying at the same time to use part of my brain to do another task. It's actually much less efficient. So it cracks me up how often I'll see a job application that says must be good at multitasking. That's like saying, well, to fit into this culture, you have to do things that are inefficient and stressful. So anyway, for what that's worth. Now, the next part of the definition of mindfulness is in a particular way. And sometimes I don't even mention this, especially to beginners, because it sounds really weird when I try to put it into words. But this particular way has to do with the attitude that gets fostered in mindfulness. And it's not something you can force. It sort of develops as a side effect, we might say. But this attitude is one of curiosity, of interest, of kindness. On that 5-factor scale of personality, it was known as openness to experience, toward our own experiences, right? These are my thoughts. These are my emotions. These are my body sensations, even if they're painful. But what happens is a lot of us get caught up in a war against ourselves. So we get stressed about our stress. We get anxious about our anxiety. We get depressed about our depression. We grieve our grieving. We're sad about our sadness. We're guilty about our guilt. We're ashamed of our shame, on and on and on and on. And it's funny, it doesn't make sense when I try to describe it in words, but if you practice, you know what I'm talking about. It's the ability to say, oh, sadness is here, right? It's not like it's an alien that invaded my body that I have to go to war against. It's my own experience. In fact, I love Steve Hayes of ACT fame, um, likes to tell clients, if you try not to have a feeling that's already here, it's like saying it's not okay to be me. I've got to get rid of the sadness. Well, you're kind of saying it's not okay to be me, because in this moment, me includes some sadness, for whatever reason. Doesn't mean we want to get stuck in it or spiral down into it, but to recognize this is my emotion. I don't have to fight myself. Likewise with my thoughts. We're going to talk about all of these a lot coming up. But if I start fighting my own thoughts, I'm pretty clever. I can outthink myself pretty well. And next thing you know, you're in this back and forth. You're not good enough. Well, yes, I am. No, you're not. Well, what about this thing I did? You just did it to show off. This back and forth versus recognizing, oh, wow, I'm having a lot of thoughts about how bad I am. It must mean that I'm not feeling good today, or I'm really stressed out today. You don't have to fight your own thoughts and emotions. Likewise with pain, we're going to talk about chronic pain tomorrow. And by the way, don't ever tell somebody with chronic pain, hey, just feel it more and it'll be great. Their BS detector is going to go off and they're going to run out the door, right? Pain by definition hurts. But what we can do is at least shift the relationship to it and help them let go of some of the struggle with themselves. This is your body. Yes, maybe it's really let you down or it's caused you so many problems or whatever, but it's still your body. So what happens is here's the pain. And then I tense up against the pain and I'm fighting the pain, struggling with the pain, and create, again, more and more trouble. It doesn't help me. And we're going to go a lot more into this when we get to the clinical stuff, but I think this would be worth mentioning now. We really want to help clients get to the place where they can relate to their own experiences with kindness. And again, that doesn't make any sense when somebody comes in the door and they're fighting and this is awful and the problems they have are very real. But when they add struggle with themselves, it's going to be much harder to deal with any real issues going on in the world. So we want to shift the relationship to the emotions that come up. And when you use mindfulness to pay attention, you're actually going to move into it, as I said, not get away from it. And again, I'm going to go into much more detail on this later on, but I want to give you a taste of this. So instead of, oh, don't think about or experience what you're feeling now, think about a happy place or a beach or whatever. Yeah, there's a time and a place for that kind of technique. But let's really look at what is here. What are you experiencing? What is this anxiety, for example? Sometimes I'll even tell clients this story to help illustrate this point. Do you remember back in the 1950s, Schachter and Singer did these classic studies on emotion? And I don't even know if they'd be able to get away with it today with the current IRBs. But what they did is they brought a bunch of people in and they said, we're going to give you a vitamin shot. And we want to see if this vitamin shot helps your performance on this test. So people came in. Now, in reality, it wasn't a vitamin shot. It was an adrenaline shot, epinephrine. And they didn't tell them that, but they just wanted to see what would happen if suddenly your body is full of this stress chemical. What would you do with that? And so in one situation, the person next to them, it was a Confederate, right? Somebody that worked for the researcher, but they're pretending to be a subject. And so the subject just thinks it's another subject in the room, right? In one condition, the Confederate next to them acted really irritable. Oh, this is a waste of time. I can't believe we're here. This is so stupid. I got better things to do or whatever. So here's this person full of adrenaline, their heart's beating and their stomach's churning and blood's rushing. And at the end of that, they were asked, how are you feeling? More likely to say, yeah, I'm really irritated. Now they set up another condition where the person next to them was really happy and excited and a great mood. And at the end of that, here's again the same body sensations of heart beating, stomach feel sensations, and blood rushing. And they said, I'm excited, more likely to say I'm excited, right? So here's the exact same body sensations going on, and yet how you interpret that, what you do with that, how you relate to that affects your mood. And by the way, this is probably why people love or hate roller coasters, right? Here's this sensation and your heart's pounding. Some people are terrified that they're going to die. Some people are so thrilled and excited. The older I get, the less exciting it is for me. But my younger daughter just loves roller coasters because she doesn't know you could die at any moment if it fell off the tracks or whatever. But anyway, here's your body sensations, and how you relate to that has an effect. So what's even more interesting to me, by the way, is they did some more follow-up studies where they still told them the shot was a vitamin shot, but as they gave them the vitamin shot, what they said was, oh, by the way, a side effect of this shot is that your heart's going to beat faster and it'll feel like your blood's rushing, your stomach might feel funny, and etc. But don't worry, this is a normal side effect of the shot and of the vitamins, and it won't hurt you in any way, and it'll go away in a couple hours. So they set up the same two conditions where the person next to them was either irritated or happy. And guess what? The subject did not change their mood rating. In other words, they felt their heart beating. They felt whatever was going on in their body. And they told themselves, well, this is just because of the shot. I'm not happy. I'm not sad. I'm not excited. I'm not irritated. It's just what my body's doing. So what I'll tell clients is, hear me now, believe me later. You can get to a place where you recognize, oh, wow, look at that. My heart's beating quickly. My stomach's churning. Maybe I'm anxious. Maybe I'm feeling stressed out. And that's it. Right. But what do most people do? Oh, no, my heart's pounding. It's terrible. It's going to explode. And then I'm going to die. And if I die, who's going to take care of my kids? Because my uncle's the one that's on the list, but I don't think he's going to be a good parent. And he probably won't even make them go to college. And if they don't go to college, they're going to never be able to earn a living. And the whole economy is going to explode anyway. And you felt your heart beating, and now you're worried about the whole economy exploding, right? This is what our brains tend to do. So this is why this takes practice. And I'm going to talk about how to get there. Just to recognize my heart beating is not my enemy. It's not pleasant. It's not fun. It's not something I want to happen, but this is not my enemy. And again, the reality may still be very serious that I have to deal with, but I'm going to deal with it with eyes wide open if I'm not spending all the time fighting myself. So just a few things to consider about this attitude. In fact, what we're going to get to is that people who practice mindfulness actually rate higher on scales of self-compassion. So a very interesting so-called side effect. All right, now the next part of this definition is on purpose. And this gets at the intentional quality of mindfulness. And this is one of the things that makes it different from other kinds of meditation. I'm going to talk about that later on, but there's a purposefulness here. I choose where I want to place my attention. Sometimes people come to me with this attitude of, well, what would mindfulness do? Well, mindfulness wouldn't do anything. It's just attention. So where do you want to place your attention? What's important to you? And are you choosing to do that, or is it automatic? So for example, we've only been here, about an hour and a half or so. And my guess is, oh no, only 50 minutes. I'm thinking about the different time zones. So not even an hour we've been here. My guess is most of you have had your minds going off. I said this earlier, right? Maybe you're thinking about clients, or maybe some of you are thinking about clients, right? Gee, I'm here, but I took the day off, but I had to cancel this client. I'm kind of worried about this client. Maybe I should be calling them. So my if I were to know, if I knew that, I wouldn't tell you, don't think about clients. You have to pay attention right now. If I were to ask you a question, what I'd ask you is, are you thinking about clients right now on purpose? Now, some of you might tell me, yes, I've got a client that's suicidal. Maybe I should be checking in with them. And okay, great. So you're doing that on purpose. Maybe you're making a safety plan that you can share later on. You're thinking about where you can find an open hospital bed, whatever it might be. But my guess is a lot of you would tell me, yeah, I don't want to be thinking about clients all day. I can't help it. My mind just keeps doing it automatically. So the practice is to notice, oh, look at that. I'm thinking about a client right now. Is this helpful or not? If so, go ahead and do that. If not, okay, maybe I can put my attention somewhere where I want it to be, hopefully up here, but wherever you find it useful in this moment, right? So there's an intentionality to that. So in that sense, I never tell people what they have to do or what they should pay attention to. It comes down to that question of how's that working for you? And if something's not working for you, probably your attention is going to be an important factor there. Um, Now, whenever I say how's that working for you, I kind of have this automatic thought about a client I worked with years ago on an inpatient unit. This was one of those lockdown psychiatric inpatient units. You couldn't even go outside to smoke a cigarette until you met whatever criteria to be able to go outside under supervision or whatever. So it was, a lockdown unit. And I'll never forget this one woman who I was running the group there told me the story after it happened. Um, I didn't even know you could do this, but somehow she got one of the, those J pipes or whatever you call them, where they come down off the sink. The water kind of goes up in a J and then comes down into the sink. Somehow she got this pipe off of the sink. I don't know if she unscrewed it or she kicked it off or how that happened, but she got this big J pipe. She goes over to the exit door, and of course, it's all locked down, but it had a small window, like the rectangular little window just to peek through. And this window even had wire mesh all through it. But she took this J pipe and she started wailing it into the glass to try to break through this glass. And eventually she broke enough of an opening in the bottom that she could get her hand through it. Now it was all glass and the wire, it was cutting her arm all up, and she stuck her hand down to the latch to be able to get out. But just about that time, all that racket attracted the attention of the staff, and so they tackled her to the ground. And then, as a consequence to this, I think she spent some time in the ER to get her arm all cleaned up and patched up. But as a consequence of that, when she got back, she now has a room by herself with nothing in it but a mattress and 24-hour surveillance and all these restrictions. So she's sitting in the therapy room, telling us all this. And so at the end, I basically asked her, was that worth it? And I'll never forget the way she stared at me and she said, obviously, you're not a smoker. Right. So now, in a different context, that go-getter attitude, no matter what, I'm going to get this cigarette, right? That could have been an adaptive feature. But in this case, what was the real question, right? The real question was, what do I do with these cravings, with these feelings, with these withdrawal symptoms, or whatever with this anxiety, whatever it was she was experiencing? Now, she's right. I'm not a smoker, but my understanding is it only takes like 7 or 8 seconds for that nicotine to hit your brain because it goes right into your lungs, right into your bloodstream, straight across the blood-brain barrier. So she knew in 8 seconds she could feel better. But if you step back and pay attention on purpose, maybe there are other options. Maybe I could ask for a patch. Maybe I could figure out how to get my privileges raised so I could step outside under supervision, something. So anyway, that's what this comes down to. Are you doing what you're doing on purpose? Or have you fallen back into some automatic pattern that may or may not be helpful in this moment? All right, and the next part of this definition is in the present moment. Now, this is really a trick thing. I'm going to talk about this in a moment just to mess with some of you. But, the only time you're ever going to pay attention, do anything, experience anything is in the present moment, right? But in our minds, we're always thinking about other times and other places. So one of the things we're doing with mindfulness practice is coming back to this moment. Oh, look at that. I'm thinking about tomorrow again. What's right in front of me? Now, certainly there's times you want to choose to pay attention to what's going on. You want to have some direction for your life. You want to plan some things, right? But if you're doing that all the time, you're missing out on your life as it's happening, right? So that's the practice. What am I experiencing right now in this moment? Now, here's the thing, and I'm guessing a lot of you already have a lot of experience with mindfulness, so I'm going to mess with you for a little bit. So don't do this with your clients. I'm going to mess with you for a little bit because there's a big joke in all this present moment stuff, right? Some of you might have thought, gee, I'm going to sign up for this workshop so I can be more in the moment. Maybe when I do these exercises, I'm going to get more in the moment. You know what the big joke is? You can't get out of the moment. Somebody get out of the moment, right? That's the Zen teacher in me coming out, right? You're always in the moment. There's nowhere else to go. So what's the problem? The problem is we confuse our thoughts and mental representations in our minds with what we're experiencing right now through our senses. Now, even thoughts about the past and the future are happening right now, right? We just get confused like they're the reality versus what we experience through our senses. In fact, this word empirical is very important. We're going to be talking later about empirically based interventions, right? Empiricism, that's science, right? Do you know what the word empirical literally means? Evident to the senses. Right? I can see it, I can touch it, I can hear it, I can smell it, I can taste it. That's what empirical really means. So consider this. Now, again, don't mess with your clients like this, but consider this. Empirically speaking, nothing exists but this moment. Right? You can't touch the future. It's an idea. You can't put your hands on it. It's an idea in your mind. You can't smell the past. I mean, you might smell a consequence of something that happened in the past, but you'd be smelling it right now in this moment, right? It only exists in your mind. Now, again, very, very useful, very important to learn from the past and plan for the future, but don't get confused like they're somehow more real. Um, and again, I'm kind of overemphasizing this for effect. But one of the reasons why mindfulness is about sensory experience is you can only experience things through your senses in this moment. And that becomes very important when we get to the exercises, because even with pain in this moment, again, I'm not saying this is easy, but in this moment, there's a tightness, there's a burning, there's a throbbing. But in my mind, I can call it pain. I can think of years of pain. I can think of years of pain to come and add all this extra onto what's really here. Or I can hear something, but then add thoughts about what I think I hear on top of that. But the reality is you can't hear anything except what's going on now. So all of our senses are anchoring us into this moment. In fact, in this moment, I can hear my dog barking. So hopefully you can't. But you just notice your senses in this moment. It's a way of anchoring yourself to this moment, which again, you can't leave the moment anyway. But I just thought I'd mess with you a little bit there. Um, Now, here's a practical application of this. And people would always write this down when I was giving presentations. So I finally wrote it down in the slide here. So I want you to think about this, or see if you can experience this. The feeling of being busy, the feeling of busyness, only comes when you're thinking about what you're not doing. The feeling of being busy only comes when you're thinking about what you're not doing, right? So the reality is, I'm sitting here talking to you right now. But if in my mind I'm thinking, oh my gosh, when the break comes, I'm gonna have to walk the dogs. I hope I can do that in time, and I hope it stopped raining. And later, my daughter's gonna come home. I hope she doesn't, make too much noise. And then I got a group tonight, and what are all those people going to be doing? And tomorrow I've got a whole nother day of doing this. And then Friday, oh man, I've got 7 clients. What was I thinking? Scheduling 7 clients. You can feel really busy when the reality is it doesn't matter if you're doing nothing later or a lot of things later. I'm just doing this right now. And then during the break, I'll be walking the dog. And then during lunch, I'll be eating. And then at the end, I'll, be with my family. Right. Right. But when you're carrying the whole day in your mind, you're going to feel busy even though you can only do what's right in front of you. Now, again, there is a time for triage. Okay, when I look at my list, what's most important? But if I'm trying to think about my list all day long, I'm not getting it done any faster, and I'm just creating stress in my mind. Now, it's a habit to keep thinking about what else I'm not doing. But over time, you can just get in the habit of, okay, what's next? Okay, okay, let me plan my day. Okay, and now I'm doing this. And so whatever it is you're doing, can you just be in what you're doing right now? And it's a kind of a funny thing to say, but if you're present in the moment, you can get more done because you're not filling your mind with all the stuff you're not doing. All right, the next part of this definition is non-judgmentally. And this is a confusing word to people. Some people have talked about tossing it out of the definition because it just creates a lot of confusion for some people. Because judgments are not bad, right? Um, Judgments are very important in our lives and they're even useful. But if you can never turn them off, that's when they get in our way, right? But you have to make judgments. Is this workshop worth my time and money? Maybe some of the judgment's still out, although it's free. So double your money back if you're not satisfied with this presentation. Anyway, I have to make judgments. Is this going to hurt me? Is this going to hurt somebody else? Judgments in that sense are important. But if I'm constantly doing it, it takes me out of the moment. Right. So if during this whole workshop, you're thinking to yourself, well, this guy is all right. And he thinks he's kind of funny, but we should really have John Kabat-Zinn here giving this workshop. Even if that judgment's true, while you're thinking about that, you're not present right now. Your mind is somewhere else. And, don't we all have at least one friend or especially family member that no matter how good something is, they find something about it to judge, and they're probably not very happy people either, right? So you could be at this beautiful wedding and everybody's eyes are wet with tears of joy, and the person next to you is like, I would have never worn a short sleeve dress like that. That's just ridiculous. I can't believe that's what they're wearing. Whatever you're doing, you can find something about it to judge. And so what happens is, instead of being present, all your experiences are filtered through judgments. So I like to describe it as temporarily suspending or setting aside that constant, habitual, compulsive tendency we have to judge or compare this moment to some other time and place. So again, it's not that we want to get rid of the judgments, but it's sort of like setting them aside. Judgments can be good advisors, but they make terrible dictators if they're just constantly filtering everything. So they're kind of over here, maybe useful, maybe not. Because again, it actually would be dangerous to completely get rid of judgments, right? We're going to be doing some mindfulness practices in the next couple of days. So if you're sitting there and suddenly the fire alarm goes off, and by the way, this has actually happened to me because I've done this so many years just by sheer chance. Sometimes the fire alarm goes off in the middle of a mindfulness exercise, right? The last thing you want to do is, oh, I'm aware of a shrill piercing sound, but I'm not going to judge that. And oh, it's getting increasingly difficult to respirate. How interesting. And oh, the temperature of my flesh seems to be increasing exponentially. How curious. In that moment, you better make a judgment to get up and get out of the room, right? But you know what? More likely, what I find happens when people are practicing is, you're sitting here feeling your breath, let's say, as a way to practice focusing. And then you notice, gee, my stomach feels a little full. Maybe I ate too much for breakfast, and gee, I really need to learn to eat less. And I think I just judged myself. No crap, I just judged my judgment of myself, right? So we can get really caught up in this. Or, dang it, I wish those people would stop being so happy outside my door and laughing and carrying on. I'm trying to practice being compassionate over here, right? So you notice that judgment, and then you come back to your breath. You notice the judgment. Oh, judgment about my judgment is here, and bring your attention back to the breath. That's it. You don't have to fix it. You don't have to go on and on and on. If you're judging your judgments, okay, just notice that. So that's kind of the attitude we want to get back to, recognizing them. You're not going to turn them off. You just want to, as I said, sort of step back from them, set them aside. It gets hard to put into words, but you can experience this, of course. And the last part of the definition is to the unfolding of experience moment to moment. Now, this might sound contradictory to what I said about there only being this moment, but I leave this part in because it's important to recognize mindfulness is an active, dynamic process. It's not just sitting still. Now, we may sit still as a way of reducing the variables that we're working with so that we can practice focusing. But the whole goal of this stuff is to bring it into your life. I've been places sometimes where people almost have this attitude of nobody move, I want to be mindful, right? In fact, I'll never forget, I was doing an in-person workshop, and as I'll do with you, and I invited people to do mindfulness exercises. I said, try it with your eyes open. You might shade your eyes or close your eyes if you prefer. Experiment with that. At the end, this guy came up to me and said, I've been practicing mindfulness for 20 years and I've never done it with my eyes open. I was like, how do you drive a car? How do you interact with human beings? That's the whole point, is it's not to make it different from life, but to bring it into your relationships, into all the things you're experiencing, right? In fact, this really hit me um, years and years ago when I was training to become a Zen teacher. I would do the interviews with the students. So they'd come in one at a time between meditating, and my teacher would be sitting right behind my shoulder, giving, to give me feedback. It was a little intimidating, but I learned a lot. It was a great experience. But I'll never forget, this guy came in and he said to me, I've just loved being here at this retreat. After a few days, my mind's finally settled down and I'm not worried about work constantly. And I feel like I'm really present. This is really wonderful. And he said, how do I keep this going? Because what I'm afraid of is when I get back home, I'm going to forget to practice again. And then I'm going to go back to just being the way I always was. And, how do I get this practice in there to be able to be more present in the moment? And I got caught up in trying to explain it to him, right, intellectually. And this was a Zen retreat, not the place for that, right? Suddenly my teacher booms in, great teacher, you've been hooked. The student has hooked the teacher. So we're all laughing. My teacher leans forward to the student and says, you asked me that question. So he asks him the same question. And my teacher says, why are you making practice different from this moment? Now, I don't know if that makes any sense to you right now, but that was a profound moment in my practice, right? It's not like there's practice moment and then there's talking to my children moment or walking the dog moment. It's always the present moment. And I hesitate to even say this because it starts to sound like I'm bragging or something, but maybe it's just because of years of practice or whatever. But I don't feel any different right now as I'm talking to you as I do when I'm sitting with my legs folded or doing a formal practice of some kind. It's always the present moment. So that's important. Now, here's the thing. If I say this to a beginner, then what they'll do is say, oh, well, then I don't need to ever practice. So we have to be careful with this, right? And it's really true of everything. When I go into a therapy session, I mean, I sometimes have a plan, but usually I see what unfolds. And so you can't tell a brand new therapist, yeah, just do whatever unfolds, right? If you're an expert guitar player, you can play anything and it sounds beautiful, but that's only because you spent years and years learning to play chords and music and scales and all of that. So I heard somebody once say discipline is the key to freedom. So I find that very interesting. But I emphasize this because sometimes people make mindfulness a thing. And I think you know what I mean by that. It becomes this separate from life kind of thing versus, one more tool that helps me be more present in all my experiences. So I just want to mess with you a little bit with that. So we got about 20 minutes before our break for the morning. So let me just say a few more things about what mindfulness is. After the break, we're going to get into more of the specifics of how it works, clinically speaking, anyway. And by the way, let me emphasize, I'm not here to undermine anybody else's spiritual use of this or other experiences with this. I just want to look at how we can really help clients with this in very specific ways. We're also going to have some exercises coming up that I'll share with you and we can do together after the break. So one of the ways we help clients bring this into their daily lives is just some very small, simple things. One is to simply ask yourself, what am I doing right now? Right? Because as I said, we have such a habit of thinking, what's next? What's next? What's next? That the next thing you know, you're dead and you missed your life because you were always thinking of what's next, right? So what am I doing right now? Just ask yourself that question. Now it's hard to remember to ask yourself. Uh, Most people don't wear watches anymore. I don't know if you can do this with your phone. Um, but you can set a chime maybe to go off once an hour. Actually, there's an app called Mindfulness Bell. There's probably lots of different ones, but I think that's a free one. Uh, and I once had a student tell me you can set it for however often you want this little bell to go off. You can set it once an hour or random times or how many times a day or whatever. So she was doing this. And so in the middle of working or whatever, suddenly this bell just goes ding, just softly to remind you to come back to the present. And she told me, I find myself all throughout the day just hoping that bell's about to go off. And I said, well, you can be in the present moment anytime you want. You don't have to wait for the bell to go off, but it's just one of those things to help pull us out of this automatic pilot mode. Obviously, being present with friends and family, this is one of the reasons why total strangers tell you their life story, right? If you're a therapist, because you've learned how to listen and be present. And we know how valuable that is. Becoming aware of thoughts and feelings and sensations throughout the day. We're going to talk more about this. But instead of just once a day or once a week or whatever, I'm going to stop and check in with myself. Just it becomes a habit to notice, oh, I'm noticing some tension in my neck. And if you notice it now, maybe it doesn't turn into a headache later on. You notice what your thoughts are doing and how they might be affecting you. I remember once I had a day where I was just in this grumpy mood and I couldn't figure out why because things were going okay. And then I just paused for a second and checked in and I noticed my mind had a song in it. Um, I had gotten an email from Pessy that morning saying they were going to send me to Allentown, Pennsylvania to do a workshop. And so that Billy Joel song was in my head. And if you remember that song from the 80s, it's pretty depressing, right? They're shutting all the factories down and you're not getting up today. So this is like playing in the back of my mind, affecting my mood. And I wasn't even aware of it. So just to notice, oh, that thought's here. Isn't that interesting? The other thing we do in the formal 8-week programs, and obviously you can add this into anything you want, is ask them to pay attention to just one daily activity and to do it mindfully, right? So, for example, brushing your teeth. How often have you brushed your teeth so quickly and so automatically that you're walking out the door for work and then you ask yourself, oh my gosh, I don't even remember, did I brush my teeth or not? So you're trying to taste your teeth and see if there's any taste of toothpaste on there, right? So if that's the activity you pick, just decide, okay, I'm going to pay attention, even moving my arm toward the handle. Isn't it amazing that you can do that? Little babies can't do that, right? And you know which direction to turn it, and it has a little resistance to it, and maybe it makes a little bit of a sound. The water comes out, it makes a certain kind of a sound. A smell will rise up from that water. You put your toothbrush in there and it hits the bristles and puts a little weight. There's all kinds of stuff happening that we just completely tune out. Now, it doesn't mean every time you brush your teeth has to be a mystical experience necessarily. It's just a way of training ourselves. Can I be present with what's happening? And this is really important. We're going to talk more about this later on. But even if you don't like what's happening, you want to be present. I get all these mindfulness cartoons, and feel free to email them to me if you see some good ones. But you've probably all seen this cartoon of somebody sitting in a meditative posture, and it says, "Today I will be fully present, unless I feel uncomfortable, in which case I will eat a cookie." you know, but the reality is, if something uncomfortable is happening, it's a good idea to be more present, believe it or not, right? If you break your arm and blood's spurting out and you run into the emergency room, it's kind of funny. I once did a mindfulness workshop for an ER staff. But anyway, if you run into an emergency room with a crisis, you don't want your physician looking at you and saying, oh my gosh, that's freaking me out. Hold on, I'm going to close my eyes and go to the beach for a few minutes and I'll be back with you once I'm calm, right? You want that physician to be fully present, even if they're anxious, even if they're having thoughts of, I hope I don't get sued for malpractice. You want them to be present in a crisis and they're going to deal with that crisis better. So that's the goal. And this is another thing I'm getting at. Watch out for teaching mindfulness as an avoidance strategy. Yeah, let's get rid of that bad stuff. Let's just stay calm. There's a time for grounding, and we'll talk about that. But you want them to also learn the skill of, even as something bad is happening, I want to be present. I want to help with, I want to notice it. I want to deal with it better. And, so that's what this is about. You may not always be happy or relaxed necessarily. And, this brings me to another concept that we're getting at here. And this actually comes from Kelly Wilson, who's co-author of the original ACT book. But this is a wonderful question to ask yourself and ask your clients. Are you approaching life as if it was a math problem or as if it was a sunset? Now, in fact, I think in his book, he was asking this question as a supervisor to his supervisees. And he asked, are you approaching your clients as if they were a math problem or as if they were a sunset? But I find this as a useful question to ask about life itself, right? Now, at times, intellectual analysis is useful, right? You want to try to figure out, what are the symptoms, what's going on, what would be a good treatment strategy, etc. If something's broken, you got to think, what's wrong? I got to diagnose the problem. I got to think about how I'm going to problem solve, right? But what can happen, as I said, is our minds become what we're exposed to. Remember how we talked about that? So if all day long, all you're doing is problem solving, suddenly your partner becomes a problem to be solved. Your kids become a problem to be solved. Um, it's easy to fall into this where, I live on 7 acres. I'm so blessed. And we have a 1 acre pond and 2 barns, and it's beautiful. But there are days I look at it and say, oh my gosh, I gotta fix the aerator in the pond, and look at all those weeds growing over there. And now there's another hole in the fence. And again, there's a time I need to do those things, but other times it's just beautiful, right? When you watch a sunset, you don't sit there and think, well, those colors aren't very evenly spaced. And was that Debbie Downer in the old Saturday Night Live? Well, actually, all those beautiful colors are due to pollution in the atmosphere, right? Where, okay, maybe that's true. And maybe in another moment, you'll do some proactive stuff for the environment. But in this moment, can you appreciate the beauty? So, can you do that? As I said, in your relationships and um, in the things more often in your life. And again, can you flexibly be able to do both as opposed to always approaching things one way or another? All right. So another thing I want to get at here is the concept of acceptance, because that's also very interrelated with mindfulness. And later on, we're going to talk about acceptance and commitment therapy. But this is another one of those words that gets very misunderstood. DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, has talks about radical acceptance, very important concept. In fact, somebody came up to me after one of my workshops once and said, I talked to Marsha Linehan once, and I told her, you really should have used the word acknowledgement instead of acceptance. And she said, yeah, it's a pretty good idea, but too late. It's all printed everywhere as acceptance. I don't want to go change it all. But what we're talking about here is acceptance of reality as it is. In fact, some people use that expression, and it is what it is. And I don't know if they're using it this way, but that's a good definition of acceptance. You may or may not like it. You may or may not approve of the reality as it is, but it's just starting with how things are right now. In fact, Pema Chodron wrote a great book called Start From Where You Are, or something like that. In fact, this is a picture of Alan Watts, one of my favorite philosophers who's had a big impact on me. But he tells a story about a guy that's lost in the English countryside, and he's trying to find some obscure village. So he's getting more and more hopelessly lost trying to find this village. Finally, he goes up to a local and he says, excuse me, sir, do you know the way to Upper Tudman or whatever the place was? And the local scratched his head and said, well, sir, I do know where it is, but if I were you, I wouldn't start from here. Now, it's a terrible joke, but it really illustrates the problems of a lack of acceptance, right? Because most people would be like, oh, this isn't fair. How did I end up here? I should be on the road right outside this place. There should be better maps. I should have a better GPS signal from my phone. There should be more GPS satellites. There should be more road signs. And it's my travel agent's fault. It's everybody else's fault. And see, here's the kicker. All of that could be 100% true, but until you accept the reality that this is where I am right now, how can you possibly get to where you need to be or take the steps you need to take? So that's all we're saying is, and you have to be very careful with this with clients, right? Because there are many reasons, abuse and traumas and awful reasons why they're stuck in the past or whatever it might be. And so, validate that for sure. And you have to be very, very careful how you say this, but basically it comes down to, you shouldn't be here. It's awful. I can't imagine how you've survived up to now, but here's where we are right now. So what steps do you want to move in to make a life worth living, even with the past that you've had, even with the pain that you have, whatever it might be? This is the only place we can start from. So that's what we mean by acceptance. It doesn't mean, yeah, I'm glad this awful stuff happened to me. I'm going to, you know, this is true. Oftentimes there is such a thing as post-traumatic growth, but the last thing a client wants to hear is, hey, you're going to grow from this awful stuff. They're going to be like, yeah, yeah, right. Um, but acceptance comes down to, this is reality. I wish it was different, but here's where we are. And now what do we do? And so you stop fighting things you can't change anymore. So again, I'm not explaining it very well because I don't want to dismiss the challenges of trauma. We're going to talk a lot about trauma tomorrow if we don't get to it today. But it's starting from where you are. But it's not resignation, right? It's not curling up in the corner like Eeyore and saying, well, it is what it is. I guess that's just the way it's going to have to be. You may do everything in your power to make it different if it's even possible, but it's not wasting energy trying to change something that can't be changed. I still remember a client that came to me, and she must have read a book or something, because she walked into my office and she said, I'm in a terrible relationship and I need you to help me accept it more. I kind of cringed and thought to myself, yeah, you're using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means. um, so, by the way, first of all, I've got a lot to learn, but I've had a lot of training in domestic violence, and that was the first thought that I had is this a domestic violence situation where somebody's trapped in a relationship, they can't get out? And we could easily spend the whole workshop just on all the dynamics there. The average person, even in a physically abusive relationship, leaves 8 or 9 times and just keeps going back for a lot of reasons. And they're most at risk of being hurt or harmed or killed even when they leave. So very, very complicated. But I quickly figured out that wasn't the case. That wasn't the case. What she really meant, if I could put the words into her mouth, maybe this is what she really meant to say. I've come to discover that I'm in an unsatisfying relationship again. And I don't want to believe that I've done this again, because I've done this many times in the past and I beat myself up that I keep doing this. I want to keep believing that if only I did the right thing or said the right thing, or if we spent enough time together, then this relationship would blossom into the one that I've always wanted it to become. Plus, I'm afraid if I'm getting older, if I leave this relationship, maybe nobody will ever love me. And so maybe this is better than nothing. I need you to help me accept the reality of this relationship as it is, so I can make a clear decision, not affected by my presumptions or my past fears. I can make a clear decision if this is something I want to keep working on, if I want to leave and then deal with all the problems that happen with leaving, or just recognize that it's okay as it is. I need you to help me sort that out. So that was a long-winded way of talking about acceptance of reality as it is really where we're going with all of this. It doesn't mean you're okay with it and that you can let people do whatever they want to do. Um, in fact, and we're about at the break, so I didn't want to start a new topic, so I just want to add another piece in here. Um, I've got lots of clients, and luckily, many of them I have really good rapport with. And sometimes they'll come and say something, well, I went and spent the holidays with my mother and she just complained the whole time and she put me down and she didn't have anything positive to say. Now, again, this is somebody I've worked with for years. So I'll say, oh, does that surprise you? Well, no. Doesn't she do that every single time you see her? Well, yes. Okay, so you can accept this is who she is. It doesn't mean it's okay that she's that way, but this is who she is. So do you want to spend time with her? And if so, recognize, yeah, this is just what she does. Or you can say, no, I'm going to spend less time with her. But you're making a conscious decision. And that's the sense of accepting that that's how she is right now. Doesn't mean you don't want her to change or wish she was different, But the constantly wishing she was different is actually creating a lot of stress and not changing the reality. All right, so we're going to take a 15-minute break now. If it looks like people have been putting questions in there, so if you do have other questions, just put them in there, and we'll sort through them during the break. And then when we come back from the break, I'll uh, get some other questions, and we'll take care of those, and then we'll move on from there. So enjoy a 15-minute break. All right. Well, welcome back, everyone. Looks like we've had a lot of really good questions. I kind of browsed through them, and I think it would take the rest of the day to answer all of them. But Dr. Baggs, did you sort of come up with a summary or?
I have been
Okay.
doing my best here. We will go ahead and dive right in. I wanted to highlight a couple of your quotes that stuck out and got a lot of emoji love. My heart beating is not my enemy.
Yeah,
That's an
yeah,
important one. You know, the heart beating kind of turns us to a slew of all kinds of things. So folks really like that. I remember lately I've been trying to do a lot more cardio just to be able to feel the heart and not be so triggered
right.
by it. Something I know clients struggle a lot with. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
You also shared with us you can't get out of the moment, and I'm kind of mad at you for that one.
What's the point of this whole workshop then?
It's true, but it hurts a little, you know. I'm sure there's liberation at the other side of that, but right now I'm kind of mad at you for that one.
Okay,
So
well, just sit with that one
yeah, I will.
then.
Like you said, so many questions I've been trying to streamline here. We have, so you probably noticed a lot of interest, and maybe you're going to get here, so you can just redirect us if we need to, if you're going to get here. But mindfulness and neurodivergence, this topic is so huge in the clinical mental health field right now and healthcare. Uh, can you talk a little bit about mindfulness, neurodivergence? Give us resources for ADHD. We're talking about focusing, but ADHD, how does that come together for us? Big
Yeah,
question.
we're going to talk about that tomorrow. But just as a brief summary, the research is pretty mixed because there's such diversity among neurodivergents, right? So, as you all know, somebody with ADHD can be great at playing a video game where it's all immediate reinforcement, and and yet other people really have trouble focusing. So we really have to adapt the exercises to the client. So if you can't sit still, then you would obviously not want to teach a sitting still exercise. Or if you did, see if you can make it a game. Can you sit still for 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds? Now, again, that's fun for a 6-year-old. An 18-year-old would think that's lame or whatever it might. So there's always so many variables there. Um, but typically we would do more um, movement types of mindfulness, mindful walking or stretching or some activity, and see if you can notice what's there. Now, when we get to mindful processing, mindful inquiry, what can happen is we're modeling mindfulness. Oh, I'm noticing your foot is moving. And so I didn't notice that. And so even though in the moment, maybe not much came of that, you're starting to reprogram their mind to pay more attention to what's actually happening in the moment.
Mhm.
With things like autism spectrum disorder, again, there's such a wide range of abilities and functions and where they are. In fact, my wife is really an expert in that area. I tend to work more, I've got a lot of training, but I tend to work more with just adults on the milder end. And what's interesting for a lot of the ones I've worked with, now there's a self-selection bias because they come to me willingly, but they kind of like the rule govern nature of what mindfulness is about. So, okay, I'm going to set a timer. I'm going to systematically look at what my body's doing. I'm going to pay attention. So it's like gives them a bit of a structure with something, and to notice, yeah, what an emotion is. That's hard even for anybody. Um, but when you have difficulty identifying emotions, to help them find maybe a physiological component to how they're feeling. I'm mad. Well, how do you know you're mad? What? That's a dumb question. Well, it might be interesting to explore that a little bit. Okay, well, I'm noticing that your fist is tight. Well, yeah, and so you're starting to bring a little more awareness to what they're doing. But yeah, we'll go more into that tomorrow.
Sounds great. I like the idea of really understanding the unique experience of the people alongside the diagnosis, and even finding the strengths associated with it, like you're talking with ASD. Like what are the strengths within this condition, and how can we utilize mindfulness to support that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and in fact, there are these group mindfulness interventions where it's sort of a cookie cutter. I mean, it's not really, but there's a structure to it. Here's what we're going to do. But then there's mindfulness one-on-one, and it becomes a dialogue where it's not just, okay, I'm going to set a timer, and when we're done, then we'll talk about, you can literally have a conversation as you're doing it. What are you noticing right now?
Mhm.
What do you see? What thoughts are coming up? And so you can really customize it in that sense.
Wonderful. More to come on neurodivergence. Self-directed neuroplasticity and multitasking. We had some folks chime in. I don't know if it's I know I'm kind of like, I really like to hold on to my multitasking.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
So you're asking me to challenge that a little bit. One of the questions specifically, and there were more versions of this, can self-directed neuroplasticity enhance multitasking efficiency, surpassing those who focus on one task at a time? So are we like enhancing our neuroplasticity by getting really good at focus and then change focus and go back and forth?
Yeah,
What do you?
no, these are great questions. And I do want to be clear. I'm not saying don't do multitasking. I'm just asking people to be more aware of that process and the toll it might be taking on you. Um, this is a little bit unrelated, but I think relevant. Sometimes I have clients, and this may sound bad at first, who tell me, I'm so stressed out at work, I'm doing way too much. And I'll say, this is up to you. You know your job better than me. But as an experiment, maybe you could try doing less at work until somebody notices. Now, again, if you're in a critical position, don't take that too literally, but people are often amazed that they're pushing themselves harder and it's not actually helping their job any. But to your point, yes, uh, and I'm having a reminder too. A couple of people asked me what study I was quoting. It was actually just an experience that happened in one of my classes or one of my colleagues' classes. It wasn't a formal study. I've seen some other formal studies, but I don't have them off the top of my head as far as being less efficient with multitasking. But the thing to do is, yes, it can get better. Just as I talked about when you're driving a car, you can change the radio while you're driving, but a lot of us, when we were in driver's ed, we changed the radio and suddenly we're drifting off the road. So in that sense, yes, you can get better and better at that. What I'm saying is pay attention and see, is this taking a toll on you? So if you're doing this all the time, I can't even eat without doing something, or I'm watching TV with my family, but I'm trying to get some work done.
Mhm.
uh, I do that too, and there's important deadlines happening, but is it having an effect on you over a lifetime that suddenly you don't realize how stressed you are? And, can you also refresh your mind and just be present? But um, somebody, mindfulness can be another tool. When people found out I was doing research on mindfulness at the VA, I still remember this one person came up to me and said, I want to teach yoga for trauma. Can you get me in with the VA so I can do that? And I said, oh, that sounds great. What's your background in working with trauma? Oh, none whatsoever. I'm not even a therapist. I just think it'll be great.
Mhm.
And so people can come in with good intentions, but not realizing, you can literally open a can of worms, because here are people who don't want to feel things, understandably, because it was so awful. They don't want to remember that. They don't want to feel these things. And you're saying, okay, now let's look at them. It definitely is going to get worse, or very possibly get worse. You have to know how to be present with that and work with that in the right way.
Mhm.
As far as grounding goes, we could say, this is where it starts getting a language thing, and it's, not really that important. I think of grounding as coming to the present moment through your senses. And that's a good technique to do when someone's dissociating. Now, I've worked with a lot of clients over the years, and I've only had one or two dissociate in session. It does happen, but what can happen is you're afraid of it happening more often than it might actually happen. Now, there are certain individuals where that will happen for a long time, one in particular I can think of. And in that case, what's happening is the lower part of their brain is firing off as if the trauma is happening in this moment, even though they're just sitting with you. So you want to activate the prefrontal cortex and just start asking questions. Do you know where you are right now? What
Mhm.
color is the carpet? Do you remember your name? And, can you feel your breath? And so in that moment, it's a crisis. You're not trying to teach them or get caught up in all this other self-compassion stuff. Just bring them to the moment to get through that moment. And then what I find is the better they get at feeling their feelings, noticing the memories without getting caught up in them, and that's the stuff we'll talk about in the treatment, the less often the dissociative episodes happen because they're not afraid of it happening,
Mhm.
and their mind doesn't have to escape to dissociation. Now, again, I'm not going to tell somebody never dissociate. Their brain's trying to do something because they don't know what to do with all of this. Let's just go somewhere else. And maybe in the past, that's all they could do to survive a horrible, awful, abusive situation. It's just what they find is eventually they don't need that anymore because they're better able to stay present.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Let's try and get in a couple more here.
Okay.
Non-judgment and mindfulness. One person asked, is the concept of non-judgment and mindfulness more about practicing self-compassion rather than avoiding all judgments? You spoke to this a little bit.
Yeah, they're definitely interrelated. Um, Now, one thing to consider is sometimes when people say judgment, they automatically think negative judgment or bad judgment or you're a bad person. I'm using judgment more generally as an evaluation. And it could be good, it could be bad, it could be important. This judgment could be, yeah, that wasn't a wise thing to say to somebody. You probably hurt their feelings and it didn't communicate what you wanted to say very well. Okay, I'm noticing that, so I'll pay more attention to that. If it's a judgment, you're a bad person, what's wrong with you? That's not so helpful in the moment. And we're going to get to this in a moment, what to do with those kinds of thinking. Oh, okay, thank you for your input. And in this moment, I'm going to do this thing or say this thing or whatever it is versus getting caught up in the judgments.
Yeah. I was using ChatGPT, artificial intelligence, to help me
Oh,
sort
interesting.
questions and streamlined questions. Anyway, it's interesting because what came up was this question that says, can some people be too mindful of their experiences and sensations? And ChatGPT generated the theme over mindfulness, which I've never heard before, over mindfulness. But I don't
Interesting.
know, maybe we're onto something there. But tell us a little
Yeah,
bit
yeah.
about sort of this over mindfulness, if you were to call it that, about can you be too mindful of their experiences, of your
Yeah,
experiences?
yeah, yeah. No, there are a couple aspects to this question, but that's a really good question. And that's interesting, the over mindfulness. Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, people that are militants for mindfulness or whatever, you
Yeah.
can definitely take it too far, make it too much of a thing. Um, but there is an aspect to that where um, we kind of go through life eyes closed. I'm using, over to dicta here, over generalizing. But when you finally stop and pay attention, you might not like what you find. And so you can suddenly start to have this oversensitivity, just like if you've ever lost a tooth, suddenly you can't stop putting your tongue there or whatever. Or somebody with health anxiety, we're going to talk about this, suddenly notices, gee, my wrist feels funny. Well, it's always felt that way, but now you think there's something wrong with it, so you're paying attention to it all the time, right? You've noticed every drug study, people report dry mouth. I don't know that every drug causes dry mouth, but when they ask you, is your mouth dry?
Hmm.
Hey, well, now that you mention it, maybe it is. And so you can get fixated on that. Um, so we will talk about that's a stage that can happen. And so to be able to notice that. Um, But I have to say, sort of teasingly too, whenever I hear somebody's too mindful, um, I often wonder if they're trying to avoid something. In other words, even the Dalai Lama that I've spent time with isn't too mindful. He's present and planning and doing things, but somebody that's too in the moment will say, I'm in this moment, and oftentimes that means I don't want to work. I don't want to deal with the conflicts in my relationships. I just want to be in this moment, and that's sort of an avoidance piece to that. So it all comes down to how's that working for you? Is your life fulfilling with what you're doing? And if not, we'll take a look at it.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And it makes me think of, the spiritual bypassing piece that we sometimes can run into
Mhm.
with clients. And maybe one more question has to do with that specifically: diverse religious beliefs. What role does spirituality, given the roots of mindfulness, what role does spirituality have in our secular work with clients these days?
Yeah, no, this is a great question, and I'll try to be brief because we could spend a whole workshop
Yeah.
just on this. In fact, years ago, um, I wrote an article on spirituality and religion and psychotherapy, which then prompted the school I used to teach at to have me teach a class on it. And then I had that class actually write book chapters, and we actually put together a book on this because it tends to be, as I said, something we pretend isn't really there, so we don't have to deal with it. And then you're kind of dismissing a big part of your client's life. But at the same time, if you're not a priest or, and know all about that person's background, and you don't want to necessarily dabble in things you don't know about. But interestingly, in research, I wish I could remember the number off the top of my head. I think more people call themselves spiritual, not religious,
Mhm.
as far as a formal kind of a thing. So, what do they even mean by the word spiritual? I tend to not bring that up so much just because mindfulness is strange enough, being present is strange enough, being in therapy is weird enough, unless they bring it up first. I may or may not use that word. But when I do use the word, what I'll say is, uh, do you have any kind of spirituality in the sense of some bigger meaning in your life? And to me, astronomy is extremely spiritual, to think that all of the elements in our bodies are billions of years old, produced by exploding stars that manifested in this shape and is now experiencing itself through these eyes. In fact, we're going to do a cosmic self meditation coming up very soon. Um, yeah, I'll kind of check in with the client on how they want to apply that. Maybe they already have something similar to mindfulness, or maybe for them it's taking the time to do prayer, whatever it might be to kind of fit in with what they're doing. Now, the other thing that can happen, and this is why it's really good for us to practice ourselves, is suddenly existential questions come up. We're going to get to this in a moment. When I start to step back and see my thoughts as not me, but just things my brain does, people start to ask, well, if I'm not my thoughts, who am I?
Kind of
you
disorienting,
know,
huh?
right.
Yeah.
And if you're uncomfortable, I don't know, or
Mhm.
if you try to make something up, versus having some experience with that and say, well, let's explore that further. What do you think? Or what's been your experience? Or let's explore that more, to at least be able to be there with them as they make these kinds of insights. But it's a very good question. And sometimes I'll circle back around to the client and I'll say, you came to me because you have OCD and that's getting better now. Is this something you want to explore further? No, I just want to go back to the OCD and get that done and I'm done. Other people, no, I want to explore all this stuff. So I kind of see where the client is.
Awesome. Wonderful. We'll let you get back to the training. Thanks to
All
everyone for your
right.
amazing questions. Just keep them coming. And we will do more Q&A after lunch today.
Yeah, great questions.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Dr. Sears.
All right. So a couple more things, and then we're going to get more into the, as I said, the clinical mechanisms that are actually going on here. Taking my shot of prefrontal lobe stimulant. So this is sometimes an arbitrary distinction, but you'll often hear people talk about the difference between being and doing. Now, as we were getting at before, you can be present and do a lot of things, but this is sometimes a useful thing just to discuss with clients. So we could say that mindfulness has more of a being emphasis, which has a present moment focus, whereas most of us are taught a doing mode, which has a future focus to it. So think about the time when we're really young. In fact, my daughter would probably be embarrassed that I have this picture of her from, 12 years ago or whatever it was. But that lower left picture was something I got when my daughter she was only like 2 or 3, and it was a Montessori school we were privileged to be able to find. But this wasn't staged or anything. This was just a random, here's what your kid did at school today. But I want you to take a look at this picture. I don't know how well you can see it, but all of those kids, only 2 or 3 years old, every single one of them is fully present in the moment and focused. And I happen to know through informal observation, picking up my daughter, that some of these kids did have some attentional issues, but in this moment, they're fully present. I think the teacher was pointing at a butterfly or something. And so here's the thing, we are born with this ability to be present in the moment, right? Sometimes a client will come up to me and say, how do I teach my 2 or 3-year-old to be present? Or, how do I teach them mindfulness? And, there are exceptions, but usually I'll say, yeah, I bet your 2 or 3-year-old could teach you a thing or two about mindfulness, right? We're just born with this curiosity and presence. And I mean, think about what a butterfly is. When you're that young, a butterfly is a magical creature. It's like gossamer thin and beautiful markings, and it floats in the air. It's just really an amazing thing. But the older you get there, you're more like, it's just a butterfly. I hope it doesn't fly in my car window. I don't know what I would do if it got in there. And you don't even notice it at all, right? And so what starts to happen is this trick is played. Alan Watts, again, talks about this trick that's played on all of us from the time we're born. And the trick is the good stuff is coming in the future. If you're patient, if you postpone your current pleasures, all the golden goodies, all that good stuff's coming in the future. Hey, wait until you're old enough to go to school. Won't that be great? And you better do well in school because you want to get into kindergarten. Oh, and you better do well in kindergarten because you want to get into first grade and second grade and third grade and then middle school and then high school. And oh, well, now high school. This is when it really counts because we got to pay attention to your GPA now because you want to get into a good graduate, a good college. And once you get into college, you got to have good grades because you want to get into a good graduate school. And so it's always coming, right? And you got to get through graduate school and get that license, and once you get that license you got to get a job, and once you get a job then you'll get money, but you got to get more money, so you better focus on those promotions and figuring out how to get more money so you can get that mortgage so you can pay it off in 30 years, and all this stuff is coming and coming and coming in the future, right? Well, here's a spoiler alert for those of you who may be a little bit younger, but somewhere around middle age, do you remember that day you woke up and said to yourself, wait a minute, I've arrived. This is it, right? I'm in my life and I always have been. Where's all the magic? Where's all the golden goodies? It was supposed to be coming somewhere in the future. You were in your life all along, but somehow you were tricked thinking it was only going to be in the future. And assuming you live long enough to retire with your health intact, what do most people want to do? Like in the lower right corner, sit around with their friends and look at butterflies. What was the whole point of that journey? Right? So we're tricked into thinking it's coming, it's somewhere else, right? Now, again, don't misunderstand me. It's important to have direction for your life. What do you want to be doing, and take small steps? It's important to learn from the past. You don't repeat mistakes and you grow from that. But you don't want to be so lost in living in those past and future times that you miss out on your life right now as it's happening. All right, so I wanted to add the self-care stuff first, because I thought if it's at the end of the presentation, it would be awful if we ran out of time before we got to self-care. So this is a subtle message that we want to put self-care first. One of the examples I like to use, even with clients, is if you don't take care of yourself, you're going to be no good to anybody else. Some people are like, well, I've got so many things to do and I'm busy, and but if you don't take care of yourself, what good are you going to be? If you've ever been on an airplane, they automatically, they're required by the FAA to say, in the unlikely event of loss of cabin pressure, or I guess to keep up with modern news, if the door blows off in the middle of the flight, mask will drop from the ceiling. And have you noticed they always say, put your own mask on first before assisting other people? I think there have been documented cases where we're so trained to not be selfish. Oh gosh, let me help you put your mask on, right? If I don't have oxygen, if I'm not taking care of myself, I'm going to be no good to anyone else. So this is an important subject for ourselves as caregivers, as well as for our clients. The problem is we get so many double messages, and I felt really bad when I was a full-time professor and a doctor of clinical psychology professor. I even joked with the students how always felt like I was talking out of both sides of my mouth, right? Because all through grad school, I'd say, take care of yourself, pace yourself, make sure your mental health is good, and read 1,000 pages by next week and give me a 50-page paper. So there's always these double messages. And then you get into clinical practice. Here we are all day long teaching our clients, and I bet you've said this, I think you're doing too much. Maybe you need to take a vacation, maybe you need some time off. And then we're terrible at taking vacations. I remember looking once at the hours. It's awful. People actually taking time off, taking vacations. So here we are telling all our clients to reduce their workload, and yet we're constantly under pressure to have more billable hours, more billable hours. And so one thing we have to really watch out for is compassion fatigue, which is the very nice word for burnout. And in fact, at the CDC, I was giving a presentation on burnout and all these different factors that go along with this. In fact, cynicism is one of the signs of burnout. So if you find yourself saying, oh, isn't it cute that the new person cares about the clients? You might be approaching burnout. So pay attention to those things. But the problem is it can come on very gradually. You don't notice it coming. Now, these are older statistics, but I think they're still illustrative. They say 97% of us live with the fear of a client committing suicide. I've got one right now whose life, and this is, I think you all understand what I mean by this. I understand that thinking. Her life is really awful. And so there's a chance she may follow through with that. So, we're working on that. The challenge is, can I be aware of that, work with that, but not carry it with me all day? And in one study, at least, more than half of us reported that our concerns about clients negatively impacted our own personal functioning, including sleep, diet, concentration, and focus. So there's another very real consequence is we're concerned about our clients, and hopefully you got into this field because you care about people. So it can be hard to turn off caring about people. And we're not exactly saying turn it off, but make sure that it's not affecting you in a way that makes you uh, less effective in your work, not to mention the toll it takes on you personally and emotionally. Somebody made the observation that's probably obvious that we are all trained to attend to other people's emotional states and their difficulties. We're always looking, how can I help you? What are you going through? Are you feeling okay? And so that can, again, that self-directed neuroplasticity. I'm training myself to always pay attention to other people and their needs, and I forget to pause and look at my own needs. And so obviously I'm biased, but mindfulness is just a great tool for this. It's a way of turning toward myself. I mean, you can do other things with mindfulness, but checking in with myself and seeing how I am doing as the provider. And there have been tons and tons of studies now. This is one of the first ones, I think. This was, I think almost 20 years ago now. But doing an 8-week mindfulness group, I think this was mindfulness-based stress reduction. They found significant declines, again, not surprisingly, in stress, negative affect, rumination, state and trait anxiety. Now, isn't this interesting? State anxiety, that makes sense that that would go down. That's the temporary state that you're in. But trait anxiety is supposed to be your personality that's fixed, relatively speaking. But that went down too after mindfulness training. So maybe you weren't really that anxious of a personality. It was something else going on. In fact, I I always irritate with the research teams I'm on because they'll say, well, we can make a short anxiety measure because we only need to measure state anxiety. And I'm like, well, actually, trait anxiety tends to decrease too, so we better measure that too. But also, very interestingly, uh, therapists that practice mindfulness have an increase in positive emotions and in self-compassion, like we mentioned. Steve Hayes once talked about research I find really fascinating that shows that emotions are kind of like a funnel. So up here, you have access to all emotions, the full range of emotions. But when you start struggling with so-called negative emotions or unpleasant emotions, you get really depressed, you don't want to feel that, you get a lot of anxiety, you want to push that away. What starts to happen is your capacity to feel all emotions decreases. So that now, because you're pushing away all the unpleasant feelings, it's really hard for you to feel pleasant feelings. And I'll bet you've seen this in your clients. One of the ways I do an informal assessment for this is I might give a genuine compliment to a client and just watch what they do with it. If they say, no, no, that's not true, or no, I'm really, but you don't know me for, okay, I bet they also have trouble being present with their unpleasant emotions as well. Or clients will literally tell me, I just don't feel joy in anything. Now that's a part of depression, of course, but the package deal, uh, you know, John Kabat-Zinn calls it full catastrophe living. It's a package deal. We want all those emotions. You don't want to get stuck in any one particular, but allowing them to flow gives the richness to life. We're not just about getting rid of unpleasant emotions. Now, this is a great study, and you can use this with your supervisor to have them, to encourage them to either have some mindfulness training for you or set aside some time to practice mindfulness in your office. Training in mindfulness increases provider effectiveness and patient mental health, even if you don't teach it to your patients. Wow, think about this. So I do mindfulness for myself as a therapist, and I do better as a therapist, and my patients get better, even if I'm not teaching them mindfulness. So what's going on here? At first that sounds amazing, but when you really consider what's happening, all we're saying is, gee, therapists that are more present with their clients and pay attention to their clients, those clients do better than therapists who don't pay attention to their clients as well and are not as present. But I think you know what I mean. If you practice mindfulness, we're going to talk about this in a moment. If I am present, if I can gently hold my clients' distressing feelings, if I can help them navigate those distressing thoughts, if I can even help understand the pain in their body, whatever it might be, I'm modeling for them a different approach. If every time they have a problem, you try to get rid of it, I might be modeling struggle and adding to the struggle. So we have to be careful about that. And again, I kind of overemphasize my points here. Obviously, sometimes we need to help ameliorate some stress, but we have to watch out that we're not teaching clients to struggle with themselves. But this is a great study to show that this is really important for us to do as professionals. And we're going to talk all throughout this workshop, but I just wanted to take a couple of points of how you can, aside from the clinical interventions that we'll get to coming up, just how you can bring this into the sessions. As I mentioned, your presence alone is very powerful. If I can stay with a client, if I can be present, if I can be a witness, as I said, model, that I'm not going to judge them and run away screaming or be terrified. Our clients say this all the time, right? Well, I was afraid to tell you this because I thought you would not like me anymore, whatever it is. Just our ability to stay present is important, and mindfulness helps with that. Self-monitoring, right? So I'm with a client, stuff's going to come up in me. Now, from a psychodynamic perspective, that could be rich material. But even at a simple level, okay, I'm having this reaction. I wonder if other people have this reaction in this person's presence. Or they're saying one thing, but I'm feeling something different. I'm going to investigate that a little bit. Now, that requires that we get out of our own way and make sure we've done our own work, that we're not projecting onto the client, of course. And a very simple thing, we're going to talk a lot more about breathing and all kinds of other exercises, but believe it or not, just taking one breath, very, very useful thing to do. I mean, for everybody, but we can get so busy with, okay, I'm doing this client, then the next one, the next, and the next one, next. Every now and then, just pause and take a breath. I remember once I attended a meditation workshop with one of my teachers, and it was on breathing. And at the end of the workshop, he said, your homework assignment is to breathe 6 times a day. Now, we all laughed, like, what are you talking about? We're breathing all the time, right? But his point was, and the number 6 is arbitrary, but a certain amount of times per day, can you just remember to remember and then go back to whatever you were just doing? It's a way of grounding yourself back in the moment. Because we do have a tendency to hold our breath, to change our breath. And we're going to talk about how much that affects our physiological system in a moment. Also, good idea to reset yourself between sessions. Some people, it scares me. We'll see people 45 minutes, 45 minutes, 45 minutes. I was working with a client once who came to me with stress, as she was a therapist. And when I found out she was seeing 12 clients a day with no breaks, maybe a short lunch break or something, I was like, well, there's your stress. Whatever I do, if the first thing is, how are you going to survive a situation where you're seeing 12 45-minute sessions a day? That's awful. Um, so it's important, and again, you may have political stuff to do to make this happen, but have time between your sessions. I mean, sometimes you open the door and the next one's face is already ready to come in. You can just say, hold on just a moment, close your door. Even if it's 2 minutes, take a couple breaths. I remember I had a practicum at a university counseling center, and had a great supervisor who said, the habits you start now as a student are likely to follow you into your professional career. So set some good boundaries now. He said, you have clocks in the room. You see one and the client sees one. It's never a surprise. It's not like you're sitting there and it's 15 after and all of a sudden it just kind of flies forward. It's very slowly progressing. You know how much time there is left. So if they drop a bomb right at the end, you can say, wow, that sounds really important. We better start with that next time, and start wrapping up a few minutes before. And He never did this to me, but we believed he might. I think a colleague of mine said he actually did it with some other students. But what he said to us was, I'm your supervisor and I'm responsible for that client. So you're supposed to end at a quarter till. So if it's 10 till and your door's still closed, I'm going to walk up to your door and knock and say, hey, is everything okay? Is there a crisis? Do you need your supervisor's help here? So because I believed he might do that, it really trained me, and I'm not always good at this, but more often than not, recognizing the time's coming up. So then you end your session, you write your therapy note, you go to the bathroom, you look at the therapy note for the next clients, you're actually prepared. And guess what? At 5 p.m., that place was a ghost town. Everybody was home with their families, not staying late writing notes or having sessions go over or whatever. And I know it's not always easy to do that, but that's a really powerful thing because, again, we're not in a sprint here. This is a long term. When you're in grad school, you can feel like I'm racing to get this done, but this is your life now. So can you find a pace that's sustainable? And then, as I mentioned, it's very normal for us all to notice tension coming up in to bring our problems with us, right? So when you leave the office, you're thinking about clients or whatever's going on. So this is another place mindfulness can be helpful. Notice, is tension rising up in my body? You might have thought, hey, I had a good day, but wow, I'm really tense. My back is sore and my neck is all tense, my shoulders. By noticing it early, you can proactively do some stretching and prevent it from getting worse. Noticing the feelings. Wow, I didn't realize where my stress level is. We're going to talk about that later on. If it starts piling up and you don't notice it, it may get overwhelming before you notice it. And then noticing thoughts. And this is one of the things we're going to get to very shortly. Instead of getting caught up in my thoughts, just notice, oh, look at that. I'm thinking about this client again. Well, that's a really good idea. Let me write that down and I'll remember to do it for our next session. Otherwise, maybe you let it go. And the attitude that we take is not, darn it, why do I feel this way? I can't believe I have all this tension. What's wrong with me for thinking this way? What's wrong with me for thinking there's something wrong with me, right? The attitude, we're going to get back to this with some techniques, is, oh, how interesting. There you are again. Almost like, there's my old friend. Again, even though it's unpleasant, it's you, it's parts of you. So just to relate to that differently. Now, the bottom line I want to talk about for just a moment, investigating versus letting go. So there are some people who take the approach of, okay, let's say I'm focusing on my breath. And so anything that comes up, I just let it go and come back to the breath. Now that's useful as a skill. And it's useful if you're living in a monastery and you don't have any responsibilities. But sometimes a thought comes up that's important. And so you recognize, oh, isn't it interesting? Every time I sit still, this thought comes up. Let me investigate this thought. Now, maybe jumping ahead a bit, but we can actually do mindful thinking. There are times you have to make really important decisions in your life. So to sit with that decision and mindfully consider the alternatives is much different than ruminating about it and making up possibilities or catastrophizing. I can step back and, okay, what are the things I want to consider about this decision? So you can choose. And that's the big piece. Am I choosing to investigate, or am I getting pulled into it? Or is it, no, this is just the same old, same old. I'm going to go back to what I'm doing. I remember hearing from a Zen practitioner, Peter Matheson, who said, sometimes when I'm a writer, and sometimes when I'm sitting, that's when I get my best writing ideas. Am I supposed to let all that go and just go back to the meditation? And this very traditional Japanese teacher said, oh, I would keep a notepad next to your meditation cushion. When a good idea comes, write it down and then go back to your meditation. So it's up to you. Again, here's where we have to pay attention, not to get too caught up in the formalities of things. Now, if constantly you're writing, well, then you can just say, well, I'm doing a writing meditation. That's something different. But there's some choicefulness here. All right, now we're going to get into the clinical mechanisms, and I got a couple exercises coming up in just a moment that I'd invite you to do with me. But here's where I really want to emphasize what's going on in terms of clinical effectiveness. So, as I said before, I don't want to dismiss anybody else's use of this stuff as a spiritual experience or, you know, there were a lot of traditions where mindfulness was just a foundational practice. Then you could go on to the more advanced meditations, because if you can't even sit still for 5 minutes or pay attention or keep one thought in your mind, you're not going to be able to do these advanced, so-called advanced meditations. So mindfulness was a foundational approach. It just turns out that if you really get it, there's all this other stuff's kind of extra. That's my editorial on that. And we're going to talk about other types of meditation coming up. But let me get to the essence of how we can use this clinically. And there are multiple approaches, and I'm going to get to those in just a moment. But here's the one I really want to almost overemphasize, because I don't see a lot of other people emphasizing this aspect of it. I think it's really important. And that's kind of an exposure therapy approach to using mindfulness. And what I mean by that is moving into and really being present with whatever's going on, even if I don't like it, as opposed to avoidance. So to step back for a moment, I've seen that not all of you are therapists, so you may get lost every now and then, but I will put this in a plain language if I can. And so this will be a reminder to most of you. One of the things that keeps anxiety going long-term as a disorder, and by the way, we're going to talk about how anxiety is natural, but when it goes on and on as a disorder, one of the things that keeps it going is avoidance. An avoidance cycle. Now, avoidance is not always bad, but when it gets caught in this vicious loop, that's when it becomes a problem. So if I see something that bothers me, let's just say, for example, um, I was doing such a horrible, terrible job and I was doing this live. Somebody threw their coffee cup at me and hit me in the head. Um, and then I quit. I'm going to feel a lot of anxiety when I see another coffee cup in the future. Now that could be a trauma situation that's a little bit different. But just for the sake of an example, every time I see a coffee cup, if that happened to me, I'm going to feel some anxiety. Now, ideally, you would just say, yeah, that was awful. Yeah, the day my career ended, that was awful. And then move on with your life. But here's something that could happen. I see this coffee cup. I feel anxiety. I don't like anxiety, right? By definition. Otherwise, you'd call it excitement. So because I don't like anxiety, I back away from the coffee cup. Now, what just happens, or what happens now, is the anxiety goes down a little bit. Now, it doesn't disappear. The coffee cup's still there. The memory's still there. But because I backed away and my anxiety went down just a little bit, your brain basically says, hey, whatever you just did, it helped us feel a little bit better. Do more of that. And this is called negative reinforcement. When you take something away and you get a result that you like, you want to do more of that behavior. So the reinforcement is repeating, more likely to repeat the behavior. The negative here is taking something away. So I'm taking away the anxiety, which reinforces the behavior. So guess what? I recognize that if I'm even farther away from this coffee cup, I feel even better. And so over time, I start to reinforce that behavior. Every time I see a coffee cup, I don't like the anxiety, I back away. I don't realize if I just wait, it'll pass. So I back away from it. And you know what? Eventually, I can even train all my friends to do this, right? Oh God, we don't bring coffee cups around Richard because it freaks him out and he gets upset and he leaves the room. So we just drink out of plastic cups here. So there's ways that it just really can spread. And, I'm kind of being lighthearted with this, but this is a very serious problem for people where they just avoid, 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 and they don't realize the only way through is exposure. Now, this isn't what clients like to hear. And so, yeah, I'll talk about ways to approach this. Don't scare them. But if you were to come to me with a fear of coffee cups for whatever reason, obviously I'd rule out traumas and all that stuff, but if it was a conditioned response, here's the treatment. I look at the coffee cup, and here's the crucial ingredient. I do absolutely nothing, right? Because they never do absolutely nothing. They see the coffee cup, they want to avoid it. They see the coffee cup, they want to distract themselves. They see the coffee cup, they close their eyes and wish they're in a happy place. And see, here's the danger. Now I'm in a happy place, but then I open my eyes and it's still there. The connection hasn't been broken. So you can do this very, very gradually. You can say the word coffee cup a bunch of times. You can look at a cartoon picture of a coffee cup from across the room. When you're ready, you can have a real coffee cup out there in front of you. And we're going to talk about exposure later on. There's very important how you do this, because you can really make it worse if you're not careful. But it comes down to, I stay here, I do nothing, my feelings will get worse. Now, this is called an extinction burst, and it's important because what happens is it's going to get worse, not always, but it often gets worse before it gets better. And this is why clients get stuck in the cycle. They say, this is silly. A coffee cup can't hurt me. I'm just going to power through this. And it gets worse. And then their brain says, yeah, see, this is a bad idea. Just walk away. You'll feel better. Okay, I walk away and I feel better. And so that's why they stay stuck in the cycle. So they have to recognize it'll go up, but it won't go up forever and ever. We know by the laws of physics, there's not infinite energy. It'll top off at some point, and eventually it'll come back down again. And so that exposure is so important. And so this is what I mean when I say be careful, because if you're feeling something unpleasant and then you distract yourself, now you're falling into the avoidance cycle. And yeah, you feel better in the moment, but you haven't dealt with the underlying conditioning of the anxiety response. Now, I don't put this in my private practice brochure, right? I don't tell people, hey, if you feel anxiety, I'm going to help you feel it more, because then nobody would ever want to work with me. So one of the ways I help people understand this principle is I use the swimming pool analogy. So I just took this picture once randomly when I was at a hotel. You ever had that experience where you go to a hotel swimming pool and maybe you're even there with your family, right? And they're all in there having a good time, and you go up to the water's edge and you put your toe in and it's cold and you're like, yeah, I'm going to sit over here and watch all you guys swim. But they're just begging you, right? Come on, don't be a wimp, come in the water, whatever it is. Um, anyway, pressure. But anyway, you decide, yeah, no, I really do want to go in the water. If you just go in the water and stay in the water, you'll be fine, right? But the worst thing you can do is stick your foot in. Oh, it's uncomfortable. So you come back out again. And then you beat yourself up. Oh, come on. It's not that bad. Let me try again. Ah, it's uncomfortable. And you step back out again, right? This is what people do with anxiety. I'm going to try it. No, I don't like how I feel. So I'm going to back away. And you just get stuck in this avoidance cycle, right? So to stretch this analogy, you have two options. You have flooding and you have systematic desensitization. Now, most people don't like flooding. It's just too intense, but technically you could just cannonball into the swimming pool. This is what my daughter likes to do, right? She just jumps in, freezes for, what wouldn't you say, about a minute, minute and a half, and then your body adjusts and then you're just totally fine. And then you have those of us who like to prolong our torture through systematic desensitization. We go over to the steps and you put your right foot in and you wait for that to adjust. And you put your left foot in and you wait for that to adjust. And you tell your kids, don't splash me or I'm getting out of this pool. And you can do it very gradually, suffering all the way. But you recognize very quickly your foot's already adjusted and now you're trying to get your knee in there, whatever, right? You can do it either way, but the point is to move into it and stay in there. Now, this analogy falls apart sometimes because sometimes people think it has to force a change. So I'm not feeling better. What's happening, right? I still remember a person who was having trouble driving a certain stretch of highway, and I was working with her. And we were doing some very gradual exposure, and I was talking about this, but without, and I would never have suggested this, but she came back to me one day and she said, you know, you told me about exposure, so I just made myself face the worst stretch of highway, uh, and I don't feel any better. I said, okay, well, describe that to me. Well, I knew it was the worst, so I just wanted to face it. So I got there and I was gripping the wheel and, talk about white knuckling it, right? And I was gritting my teeth and I got through it and I turned around and I came back and I didn't feel any better. And I said, okay, basically what you did is you jumped in the swimming pool and you ran across as fast as you could and you jumped back out again. That's kind of not quite what we're looking for here. Because the temperature of the water doesn't change, right? It's your reaction to it that changes. So I'm kind of talking about getting better with exposure, but that's not the goal. In fact, if you say it that way, hey, just feel it and you're going to feel better, you're going to get those resistant clients that say, yeah, I'm feeling it. I don't feel any better now. What are you going to do now, smarty pants? I don't feel any, You can just say, well, what are you noticing? And see what your mind is doing. Watch what's happening in your body. Well, how are you feeling right now? You can do the 1 to 10 scale if you want to, but the mindfulness aspect of it is just to notice and let go of our fighting, right? That's what's happening. We're fighting the water, and then we're just in the water, fighting our feelings, fighting the anxiety, and then there's just my heart beating. Now, again, that sounds dismissive out of context. I don't mean just heart beating like it's no big deal. To them, it's life or death. They feel like they're going to die. And we're going to get more into specifics here, but to just notice that, right? Okay, so I hope that's clear. I wanted to set that foundation because the next part is a little trickier for some people to really understand. So this is one of the parts in the 2 days you want to pay attention. So if you're just kind of doing other things, multitasking, this is one of the times in the presentation you might want to pay attention because this is a really important point. All right, so here I am with anxiety. So now I'm going to add in a mindfulness aspect to this. When I feel anxiety, what do most people tend to do? Well, most people tend to think when they're anxious, right? Usually about the future or about what the problem is or whatever it might be. Now, for the point I want to make here, it doesn't even matter what the content is of the thoughts you're having, but see if you can follow me on this. Anxiety is experienced in the body, right? That's the only way you know it's anxiety, otherwise it's a thought. So here's anxiety in my body. I don't like anxiety. It feels unpleasant. So I start thinking. Well, guess what? Now my attention is on my thinking, not on my body. Now, it's not like my body goes away or anything like that, but because I'm paying attention to my body, I don't feel, or I should say, I'm not as aware of my body sensations, right? So, guess what just happened? My subjective perception of the anxiety just went down a little bit. And my brain says, whatever you just did, do more of it because we don't feel the anxiety as acutely. In this case, it's thinking. And so our thinking gets negatively reinforced. Now, these thoughts aren't necessarily about happy things, but while I'm thinking, I don't feel the physical concomitants of the anxiety. So my brain says, think more, think more, think more. Don't feel it, think more. Now, here's where it gets even worse and where we get this awful, awful vicious cycle. Usually those thoughts are about what's going to go wrong, right? Nobody ever thinks, what if everything goes my way today, right? It's always going to be what's going to go wrong. These thoughts create more anxiety, but I don't want to feel that anxiety, so I think more, which creates more anxiety that I don't want to feel, so I think more. So this is why people get caught in a loop. People are thinking, ruminating, worrying all day long, all night long. Because what happens if they stop worrying and thinking? Extinction burst. Now I feel the anxiety more. I don't like that. I'm going to go back to thinking. Now, they don't do this consciously, but this is one of the mechanisms that could be happening. And again, I'm trying to make a point here. We're going to get to anxiety, and there's so many other factors, physiological stuff and sleep and all that stuff. But I find this a very useful approach when other things haven't been working, to look at it from this different perspective. So I'm trying to think to avoid the sensations in my body. So here's what I mean by doing exposure therapy to your body sensations. Now, as I said, what's nice is one-on-one, you can guide a client through this because this is hard for them to do by themselves. To even recognize I'm thinking a lot right now is a pretty sophisticated skill. Somebody mentioned metacognition. I'm aware of my awareness. So to notice I'm doing this is a skill by itself. So, but here's what you can do. Wow, I'm thinking an awful lot right now. And instead of arguing with it and going on with it, you can recognize maybe this is a sign of how I'm feeling, right? Because we don't ruminate when we're calm and everything's going well. We tend to ruminate when we're anxious. So if I'm ruminating or worrying, that tells me I must be anxious. So I shift my attention to the body. Now that's where you're going to find tension, heart beating fast, stomach churning, or whatever it might be, which they don't like, and they'll go back to thinking. So the challenge is, how do I keep my attention on the body sensation? Then it goes away, and then I bring it back, right? Because I mentioned this earlier, this is what the average person will do if they're able to, without help at first, able to notice, wow, my heart is beating really fast. Yeah, I am anxious. Gee, is it supposed to beat that fast? I'm not sure. It is pounding to beat the band. Maybe I better Google safe heart rates and see if that's acceptable. And maybe I should go to the emergency room. But if I go to the emergency room, they'll probably tell me it's all in your head. And then they'll mark me down as a mental patient. And then the next time I might have a real heart attack. But they send me home because they refuse to treat me because they think I'm a mental patient. And then I die due to their negligence. And if I die, what's going to happen to my kid? Right? So that's the challenge. And that's the practice piece. Oh, look at that. I'm thinking about whether or not my kids are going to go to college. Feel your heart beating. Oh, I'm wondering whether or not, and again, a judgment could come up. Hey, this has never happened before. And I usually am not an anxious person. Maybe I do need to go to the ER, but that's different than a spiraling kind of thought. So to notice it, and again, be careful how you say this to clients, but it is just your heart beating. It's not your enemy. And so when you can really feel it with some curiosity and recognize it. And I'm going to bring this up later on, but you can even use a heart rate monitor or something. There was a time I had one in my office, so I like playing with it with my clients. And I had a client going through exposure. We talked about it, did all the background stuff, and it was just neat. It was a little heart rate variability monitor, and I'll talk about that coming up. It's just a little infrared thing. And as we started the exposure, I asked her, how you feeling? She says, oh, I'm an 8 out of 10. My heart feels like it's going to explode. And I said, well, why don't you open your eyes and look at the monitor, which she could do at any time. Her heart rate was 70. I said, a lot of people's resting heart rate is higher than 70. I'm not going to be worried about you till it's over 200 for a little while. But, we have this idea, this perception that I'm dying or whatever. And so you just recognize the physiology that's happening, learn to ride the waves of it. Text. Now, we could do a whole workshop just on relating to thoughts differently and decentering and diffusion, but I want to get a few things out here and then we'll address it more when we get into the specifics. And actually, the next slide is an actual exercise. So we've been doing a lot of talking, so I want to actually give you an exercise to do with me in a moment. But working with thoughts differently. Now, CBT obviously is very well established. I still teach it sometimes. I still use cognitive processing therapy sometimes. I've gone through all that training and certification. But have you ever noticed a limitation if you're not quite doing it right? And that limitation can be that for some clients, it increases the arguing that they do in their head, right? So, and again, I'm overemphasizing my points. I don't mean to be putting CBT down, but have you ever had this happen with a client where they say, I'm a terrible person? And especially if they're trying to do this with themselves, right? Oh, come on. What's the evidence that you're a terrible person? Well, I got fired from 10 jobs. I got kicked out of my apartment. I got divorced. Well, come on. It was your partner just as much as you responsible for that relationship not working out. Well, yeah, but I'm the idiot that picked that partner in the first place. Why do I keep doing with it? Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, right? And by the way, that's harder for our clients because of something called mood state dependent learning and memory. And I'm going to talk about this later on. But basically, what it means is when I'm feeling a certain way, my thoughts relate and memories related to that feeling state are much more easily accessible. In other words, when I'm depressed, it's easy for me to quickly bring to mind all my failures, all the things I've done wrong, all the terrible things going on in the world. And they're still there, but it's much harder to activate the happy memories. So it's really hard for you to counter thoughts that way sometimes, especially when you're deeply in depression or something. Well, guess what they found? And I'm really surprised how few clinicians seem to be aware of this research. It's more and more gaining acceptance and awareness of this. But when they've actually done research studies, um, when they've done component analyses of CBT, in other words, yeah, CBT works for sure. What are the essential components of CBT? What are the actual things that make it work? You know what they found? If you do CBT without the disputation component, it works just as well. Now, some of you are going to be mad at me about this. Well, no, that's the heart of CBT is challenging thoughts, right? Well, hey, according to the research, if you don't challenge the thoughts, CBT still works. So what's going on? What seems to be implicit in CBT, and now it's being much more talked about, but what we make much more explicit with a mindfulness-based approach is this process called decentering. ACT calls it diffusion. But decentering is a term first coined by Piaget. And what it means is normally it feels like you're in the center of your thoughts. So I'm a terrible person. You're in the center of that thought. It's conditioned with all kinds of meaning and associations and emotions attached. So you have that thought, you automatically feel a certain way. When you decenter, what that means is to step back, so to speak. Now, it's not exactly, but it's hard to talk about. But you sort of step back from the thought and you recognize, oh, I'm having a thought that I'm a terrible person. Now, that might just sound like semantics, but there's a huge experiential difference between I am a terrible person and I'm having a thought that I'm a terrible person. And so the analogy that acceptance and commitment therapy uses is self as content versus self as context. And we're going to talk about this more when we get to ACT. But they use a chessboard metaphor for this. It's funny, I bought this chessboard back when I was a little kid in Mexico, and I finally got a use for it. I took a picture of it so I could illustrate this point. So the picture on the left is relating to self as content, where I over identify my sense of self with the content of my thoughts and feelings and sensations. Here we're talking about thoughts. So if, for example, I identify myself with the pieces on the chessboard, I think I'm the black pieces and I have to win against the white pieces, right? I'm going to get really caught up in that battle. Every time the white side makes a move, I got to make a move. If I lose a piece, I'm going to be really upset. But in reality, you're much more like the picture in the right, where you can step back. You're much more like the chess board in this analogy, right? The chess board is necessary for the game to happen. There would be no game at all if there wasn't a chess board. There would be no thoughts, so-called good or bad, without you present there as a foundation for these thoughts to manifest. The chess board isn't affected by the game. It doesn't matter which side wins or loses. It's not scarred by the battle. It's just the context in which these thoughts are doing what they're doing. So this is very challenging for our clients to get at first, but if you can recognize who I am is so much more than my thoughts. Here's this battle going on in my mind. Wow, look at that. There's a battle going on in my mind. That only happens when I'm really stressed out or depressed. I better go call my therapist, or I better go take a walk, or I better go do some self-care. I don't have to jump in there and fight all these battles. I can just notice that it's happening. That's not me. So I don't have to fix it per se. It's just something my mind is doing. And we're going to get a lot more into this later on, but anytime somebody tries to stop their thoughts, they tend to get worse. Thought stopping in general, there may be some exceptions, but in general, it tends to just fire up more. Now I got to remember not to think about this thought, which means I'm thinking about not thinking about this thought, which means I'm thinking about the thought, right? So just to recognize, oh, that's what my thoughts are doing. That's not me. It's not who I am. And I was hesitating whether or not to go into this, but let me just touch on it, and we can always go into it another time with an acceptance and commitment therapy workshop or something. But thoughts themselves are just sounds, right? If I were to say to you right now, "Anata wa baka desu," those of you doing thumbs up probably don't speak Japanese because I just insulted you, right? But if you don't speak Japanese, you have no idea what I just said, right? It was just a bunch of sounds. All you heard was blah, 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 blah. It didn't have any meaning. There was no emotion associated with it. It was literally just sounds. But if I say that in English, you're stupid. Obviously, I would never say that to anybody. But if you were to hear those words, do you see how those sounds have meaning and emotion connected to them, probably memories, even though they're literally just sounds? If you didn't speak English and I said you're stupid, you'd be like, why does everybody look upset right now? They're just noises. Now, these are very useful noises. Don't misunderstand me. That's what I'm doing right now to communicate with you. And it's very important, but don't forget they're just symbols. It is our own brain that puts meaning and emotion on those symbols. And if you forget you do it, then you get caught up in trying to fix something that doesn't need to be fixed. Right? The classic example in ACT is to use the word milk. Now you could use literally any word. But if I say the word milk to you, you can probably imagine a white creamy substance. You might bring to mind what it tastes like. Maybe you have memories of being forced to drink a whole glass of whole milk with every meal when you were a kid and you hated it or whatever, right? But watch what happens if I say this over and over and over again. Now, this is going to be really weird if anybody walks by your desk right now, but milk, 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 milk. So I think 30 seconds is the ideal amount of time, but probably you get the point, right? After a while, it starts to sound like it's just a sound, right? It doesn't have the association of that white creamy substance anymore. It's just a sound. Now, this is very advanced stuff, and very rarely will my clients get this unless they go through a structured 8-week program like MBCT or MBSR. There are ways to get it, and acceptance and commitment therapy has a lot of great techniques for doing that. But the good news is, if you get this as a therapist, it really helps that you don't get caught up in it. And this reminds me of the idea of content versus process in group therapy. Now, this is true in all of psychotherapy, but for a while I was teaching group therapy and did a lot of group therapy. When you're a brand new group therapist, you think you have to address and fix every problem that comes up, right? So let's say you have a brand new therapy group, never met before, but there's a person that's been in groups their whole lives, so they're free, they feel free to share. And in the very first session, they suddenly start disclosing all the intimate personal details of their sexual trauma history, and everybody else is cringing, right? If you're a new therapist, you might think you have to address the content and say, oh, well, treatment will do this, or, whatever. You can always shift to process, right? So instead of talking about the disclosure itself, the content of it, you talk about the process of disclosing. So what you can say is, wow, the fact that you're talking about such personal, intimate details right now, that tells me you feel really safe in this room. But given that this is the very first meeting, I'm guessing not everybody else here feels safe enough to really talk about what's important. What can we do as a group to make this a safe place to talk about real things? Now, do you see what I did there? I didn't say, shut up, that's not appropriate, or try to fix the problem, right? I talked about the process that was going on, right? And I've never yet, it's possible that it would happen, but I've never yet had somebody say to me, hold on a second, I see what you did there. You shifted to process, and I want to go back to the content of what I was talking about. They still feel heard. It doesn't feel too abrupt. Now, sometimes they do go right back to the content, and I'll say, isn't that interesting how we can't let go of this content? So now I'm talking about the process of not being able to let go of the content. I'm bringing this up because you can do this with thoughts, right? Your client will come in thinking a certain way, and you can recognize their thinking. For example, I bet you've all had clients come into you and they start telling you their background, and you've had a lot of experience. So you realize immediately what's going on, and you know what the problem is, and you know the things they need to do to get better. And so you say, oh, well, here's what you should do for that problem. And they say to you, yeah, I tried that. It doesn't work. And because you're a polite person, you'll say, well, here's something else that's been shown to be effective with that. Yeah, it doesn't work for me. I tried that too. Oh, well, have you ever tried this? Yeah, I tried that too 6 months ago, still doesn't work. So watch out. You might be fighting their thoughts with more thoughts. So here's where you shift the process and say, oh, wow, notice how every suggestion that comes up, your brain immediately shuts down. I bet that's happening in your mind all day long. You think about what to do, but you see that that doesn't work. I bet you feel really hopeless. Right? So the hopelessness is the problem. I don't have to fix the thoughts. So that's the great news about this. Even if they don't understand this decentering and diffusion stuff, you can do it for them. Yeah, I had another terrible day. Oh, wow. So your mind's telling you the day was terrible. Tell me about what you actually experienced. Do you see? You don't have to say, no, it wasn't terrible. You're not a terrible. You can just recognize this is what your mind is doing. And it's modeling for them the ability to eventually do it themselves. I love it. When clients finally make that transition and say, the other day I found myself having all kinds of negative thoughts. So I just decided I was going to go take a walk. Wow, that is great progress. They didn't sit there and argue with themselves all day. They recognized what was happening and then they took some proactive action. So we could go on and on and on about this, but this is a very different approach to thinking than a lot of people are familiar with. Now, if you're a younger, younger in the profession, this is not news to you at all. My graduate students love this stuff, and this is all they wanted to talk about. But for people that haven't had as much exposure, this is relatively new. And there's a lot of subtleties to this. So again, practice is important to really start to get this stuff. All right, I've been very intellectual all morning. We still have 50 minutes before we take our lunch break. So I would like to do an exercise. Now, this is a funny thing. Normally, I start with very simple exercises and work my way up, but I'm just going to jump in with a pretty far out meditation. Now, this is an actual meditation, not mindfulness. And I'll talk more about that later on. What I want you to do is visualize some things. But the point of this is to reconnect that you are more than just your thoughts, that you're more than just the problems you're dealing with. And this is another thing, by the way, that's really important. Our clients come to us with all these problems. They start to define themselves as problems, as opposed to you're so much more than your problems and all the other things. So I'm overemphasizing this one because in our society, we tend to really have a narrow sense of who we are. So this one's pretty far out. Now, it's not far out in the sense of weird because, believe it or not, this is going to be a very scientific, astronomical point of view that I want to bring up. But I'd like you to take this in the spirit of experimentation. Just kind of play with it. Maybe something in it connects with you, maybe not. Maybe it's something you could use with your clients, maybe not. But just see if you can come at this with sort of curious, open mind here. Now, the other thing is, I don't want you, well, my suggestion is don't take notes the whole time. I really want you to experience this. This literally comes straight out of this Act with Anxiety book. So I just tell you that so that it's out there, it's available if you want to do it again. So you don't have to try to remember what you're doing. You can let yourself actually experience it. But this will help kind of guide me in what we're doing. So as I mentioned, this is just a meditative exercise where I just want you to try on a different perspective. Now, how you're sitting for purposes of the next couple of days is really up to you. Just be comfortable. There can be important physiological reasons for how you sit, but for right now, just be comfortable so that you're not in pain, or at least minimize your pain if you have chronic pain. You can lie down if you like to, but there's a better chance you're going to fall asleep if you lie down. So my suggestion is to sit up while you're doing this. And then experiment, as I mentioned earlier, experiment with your eyes. If you're feeling really sleepy, I would leave your eyes open just a little bit, sort of stay present. But we're also going to be visualizing some things. So if you prefer to close your eyes so you can try to imagine it in your mind more, you can do that. So let me just walk you through this exercise. First of all, give yourself permission to be here. You know, we have a tendency to always be planning and doing other things and preparing for some future moment. Just give yourself permission to be here. Let go of all the work that needs to be done. It'll still be there when we're done. You know, the world's not going to fall apart without you for the next few minutes. So what I'd like you to do is imagine that you're a leaf on a tree. And again, watch what your intellectual mind says. Well, this is silly, but you know, when you're a kid, you could be playful in your imagination. So just for a moment, just be a little playful. Imagine that you're a leaf on a tree. Now, if you believe that you're only that leaf, you're going to be sad when the fall comes and you wither and you drop off that branch. But I want you to consider that leaf cannot exist without the entire tree. That leaf was never separate from the tree. It grew out of it. After it falls to the ground, it will be reabsorbed by the tree and new leaves will grow. Likewise, how can you be a separate human being? Your skin is not a boundary that separates you from the world. Our skin joins us to our surroundings. It's a way of connecting with the air, the sunshine, and the earth. You could not possibly exist in isolation. You are dependent on a combination of countless things and processes to be alive. The food you eat flows through you and is all produced by the earth. You need all these things in your environment just as much as you need a heart and lungs. And it took the entire earth to create this environment. Where else could you come from if not from this earth? You're not a stranger that was thrust into this world. You literally grew out of the earth. And the earth can only exist because of a sun, which moves through the Milky Way galaxy, which formed out of the universe. The universe appears to have exploded out of nothingness. Hydrogen atoms came together to form stars, which crushed the atoms into denser elements, which later exploded out into space. These atoms eventually came together to form solar systems. And at least on the planet Earth, these elements developed into self-replicating life forms. Over billions of years, human beings came about. Your ancestors produced your parents, and they produced you. Your physical being is literally billions of years old, made of the very material that first exploded out into the universe after the Big Bang. The physical being you identify with may come and go, but it does not disappear. It merely changes form. Just as a leaf develops and then transforms back into new leaves, your atoms came together from the environment and will transform back into new life and new babies. You might also imagine the universe as the ocean. If you identify yourself with one of the waves, you may get caught up in competing with the other waves. Or you might try to hold on and preserve your wave. But waves are only moving water, and you cannot hold on to them. The waves of the ocean come and go, but they are all forms created by the entire ocean. Likewise, you're a physical manifestation that was created by countless processes throughout the universe. The universe is waving you. Now, at first, these thoughts may feel depressing. You may feel that you're losing yourself like a drop of water disappearing into a vast ocean. But the opposite is actually true. You're not the drop, you are the entire ocean. You can enjoy the wave all the more, even with its transience, knowing that you are more than just the wave. The entire universe is playing the role of you. And it's doing such a convincing job of it that even you have been fooled. You've simply forgotten that you're so much more than an isolated bag of skin. You are the entire universe experiencing itself through this particular point of view. So just sit with that for a few more moments before we end this exercise. You may or may not be thinking about it. Just kind of sit with that. All right, and with that, we'll let this exercise go. So I want you to start just bringing your attention back to the present moment. And if your eyes were closed, just slowly allow your eyes to come open. And feel free to move or stretch if you feel like you need to. All right, so again, this one's pretty different. So it may not have been the best one to start with, but I thought it fit in with what we're talking about of a bigger sense of who you are. People may have different experiences. For some people, yeah, this didn't do anything or it was silly. Other people, maybe they find that useful. So take that for what it's worth. Things like this too, by the way, I find um, you get more out of it the more you do it. So doing it once may just be awkward. Um, and whether it's this exercise or another one, sometimes the more you do it, the more subtle things you get, or the more it starts to reprogram the sense of who you are. And again, not trying to push this as a belief or anything, but just to sort of create more flexibility. In fact, um, behind me, these two mandala represent uh, the universe as seen from the outside and from the inside. I mean, this is kind of a over exaggeration of what this is about, but one side is stepping back and seeing the big process, seeing it all as one process. The other one is I'm in the middle. And so I look out at the universe all around me. We call that relative truth. And then there's absolute truth. And we need both, because if you're so caught up in this, boy, you take stuff way too seriously and get caught up in it. If you're too caught up in this idea of absolute truth, and your feet aren't on the ground and you're not much help to people in the actual world. So that's just another point of view I thought I'd share. There's not, I don't know that there's much scientific piece on this way of doing it, other than the fact of a more flexible sense and a bigger sense of self does really relate to mental health. We'll talk about that later. All right, coming back into more practical stuff here in the moment. I wanted to mention a couple more things that are making, why mindfulness works. And some of this you probably already know, but the more conscious we can be about what these processes are, the more intentional we can be with our clients and why we're doing what we're doing. So one aspect of why mindfulness works is that it helps us fill the attentional channels of our brains. Now, I tend to underemphasize this aspect because I've seen some people that overemphasize it as if this is all that mindfulness does. But it is a useful thing. What we know is that our brains have a limited attentional capacity, right? There are only so many things your brain can attend to in the present moment. So, you may be able to expand that as we were talking about before if you train in multitasking, but ultimately our brains have a limited bandwidth. And there's only so many things you can pay attention to in the present moment. So if you fill the attentional channels of your brain with present moment experiences, especially, there's no room left in your brain to worry or ruminate about other times and other places, right? Because my mind is fully present with what I'm experiencing through my senses. I'm not going to be lost in ruminating and worrying. So, do you see how that could be a very useful thing at times? However, can you also see that that could turn into avoidance if you don't use it in the right way? In other words, if you're feeling feelings you don't like and you're like, oh, I don't like feeling this way, I'm going to stare at the carpet till I feel better. And do you see how that has an avoidance quality to it? However, if, yeah, there's a crisis going on, but I'm in the middle of a presentation, I'm just going to focus on the people in front of me, then it's a useful thing. But it's not something you want to do constantly in the sense of not dealing with things. A little bit of a personal story, but all of you are probably used to personal stories. A few years back, I was giving a PESI workshop. I can't remember, somewhere on the West Coast probably. And on the lunch break, I always like going back to my hotel room to take a power nap. And I happened to check my phone, and there was a voicemail message from my brother letting me know that my father had just passed away. All right, so this wasn't a surprise. He had pancreatic cancer, and we knew it was pretty bad. And he was 81. But, still, it hit me, obviously. Well, here I am on the lunch break. I still had a few hours left in the presentation. So what am I going to do? Well, thankfully, I have 5 siblings, and they're all very responsible, or yeah, most of them are. Anyway, they were doing what needed to be done. They were taking care of things. They were going to handle things. And I don't know that I could have even gotten a flight out that quickly. So now I think people would have been pretty understanding. That would have been a pretty good excuse for me to say, sorry, I've got to cancel. My father just passed away. I bet they would have been understanding. But I decided, gosh, there's just nothing I can do. So I'd just be sitting here waiting anyway. And all these people canceled their work, schedules to be here. Just a few hours. Um, I'm just going to finish the workshop. And so this is what I did. Um, and by the way, I decided not to tell them that this happened because I didn't want them sitting there the whole time thinking, oh, I can't believe you're doing this. You should go home. Why are you? Yeah. But this was very helpful. So I just looked at the slides, I looked at the faces in the audience, had our conversations. Every now and then a little feeling would well up and I'd say, oh, hello. And then I'd go back to the person I was talking to, right? And so that was fine for the few hours of doing that presentation. But can you understand if that's all I ever did? My father's passed away, but I'm just going to always be in the moment. Do you see how that's an avoidance type of thing? So, gee, mindfulness is helpful and it could be avoidance. How do you know the difference? Well, that's why all of you get paid the big bucks to take a look at that, right? And to really understand it from an internal point of view, doing it yourself. But most importantly, how's it working for you? Right? If it's helping you survive difficult situations, but you use it flexibly and other times you move into the feelings, great. If you find yourself always using it to avoid, okay, just watch out for the consequences of doing that. So let's just do a really short grounding exercise. So somebody asked me the difference, grounding and mindfulness. So we could say grounding is a form of mindfulness. It's just coming into the present moment. So there's no complications, a very, very simple exercise. So I'm only going to do this for a couple of minutes, but this is a very simple thing. So again, sit however you'd like to, close your eyes if you want, or just kind of lower your eyes. And as I said at the beginning of the last exercise, I really like to remind myself that right now in this moment, I don't have to be doing something so-called more important. It's okay to just be for a few moments. And we're just going to check in with our senses. Let's start with the physical sense of touch. Now, I'll add a caveat here, by the way. You might not like what you find. So again, it's up to you if you want to do this or not, but I just invite you. All we're going to do is notice what's already here. We're not going to add anything in. So just notice your body. You might have forgotten you had a body till just now. So what do you notice? What do you feel? Are you a little bit cold or warm? Are there different parts of you that are warmer or colder than others? Do you feel sensations from the surface that you're sitting on? Maybe sensations from your clothing. Can you feel air moving across your skin? Now, as you do this, you might find some pain or discomfort. So by all means, if you need to move or stretch or adjust yourself, that's totally fine. And for right now, though, we don't have to fix it or analyze it or get caught up in why it's there. Just kind of notice it's there anyway, whether you wanted to notice it or not. So just kind of acknowledge it. Okay, it's there. And then check in with your sense of hearing. What do you hear? Probably the sound of my voice. What else do you hear right now? And as with all the senses, can you really notice it without filtering it through commentary? In other words, if I hear a car going by, my brain will probably automatically say car going by, and that's okay. But there's a difference between the thought, car going by, and the actual sound. It's much richer. Notice too if you're straining, because muscular tension doesn't help your ears any. Just allow the sounds to come to you. And you might notice more subtle sounds, sound of your own breath or something way off in the distance that maybe you didn't notice at first. But again, instead of labeling, can you really understand the quality of the sound, the different vibrations or oscillations or pitches or tones? And then let's use the sense of seeing right now. So if your eyes were closed, just slightly open your eyes. What do you see? And, when you're a baby, it's all just shapes and colors. There's no definitions. See if you can open up your mind with sort of some curiosity, what you just see. Now, again, you're not going to turn off the labels. So you're going to see phone or pen or whatever it is, and that's okay. But see if you can just sort of set those words aside and what do you really see? Now, if you want to keep your eyes in the same place, maybe that'll reduce the complexity. But if you want to, you can look around the room. But watch what your mind does. Watch the thoughts that get associated with it. It's not good or bad. Just notice that, but see shapes, colors. In fact, you can sometimes make a game of it by asking yourself, is there anything here that I didn't notice before? Right? So you're in a room that you've been in for hours. Maybe you are in this room all day, every day, but I'll bet you can see at least one or two things that I just never really noticed that was there before. And then shift your attention to your sense of smell. Just kind of see what you notice. Now, smell is one of those things that tends to acclimate when it's not changing. That's okay, but just see when you take a breath in, is there anything you notice? And if you like to, you can pick up your phone or pen or paper or whatever and just take a whiff. And again, see if you can notice the smell without getting caught up in thinking about it too much. And then lastly, just see if there are any lingering tastes. Maybe you just had a cup of coffee and maybe there's some taste there. Maybe you don't notice any taste at all, but just for a moment, see if there's any sense of taste right now. You could even open your mouth and taste the air, so to speak. And again, I want you to recognize these senses can only be perceived in the present. You can't hear anything in the future. You can't feel anything in the past. If you feel it, it's happening right now. So these are ways of grounding us in this moment. And with that, we'll let this exercise go. So just start bringing your attention back to the room and allow your eyes to come open if they're closed. And again, feel free to move or stretch if you feel like you need to. So, any one of these exercises, you could make a separate exercise, right? Just notice what's going on in your body. We'll do a body scan later on. Um, a hearing exercise, smell exercise, taste exercise, seeing. Well, this was just a way to quickly go through all five. Um, so this is our gateway to the present moment, so to speak. And as I mentioned, we're already here anyway, but it's a way of helping our mind set aside all the fantasies about other times and other places and coming back to this moment. We'll talk about this more later on, but I hope you understood too what I meant when I said notice the sense as different from what your mind says about it, right? We hear this in all the time. Well, you said this. Well, no, you thought I said that. The actual sounds were this. Doesn't always go well if you say that in the middle of an argument, but but what can happen is our mind adds things onto our perceptions. And this is especially true, as I said, with physical pain. Here's a sensation, and it's not pleasant, but my mind adds negatives onto it, on top of it, when it's bad enough as it is. And all the ways we do this, you know. So the next component of the next mechanism, the next active ingredient in mindfulness, as people have been mentioning, and I mentioned earlier, self-compassion. Right? So, this attitude of kindness that we develop toward ourselves, because the more you're able to notice, oh, I'm having a thought that I'm a terrible person. Ah, this feeling of sadness is here. There's a clutching sensation in my stomach. Do you see? The more kind I'm becoming to my own experiences. And I have to tell you, this is one of the best things I see when I do a formal 8-week mindfulness group of people by the end saying, I was just fighting myself this whole time. And now I've learned to be kind to myself and not, in fact, one of the funny things I hear is, gee, it's weird. I used to spend all day arguing with myself in my mind and of trying to avoid my feelings and what I'm doing and what's happening in my body. What do I do with all this free time? Well, yeah. So now you got to decide what you value and what you want to make your life about. So this is another exercise. So here we are jumping into a lot of exercises here, and then we'll go back into some clinical stuff. But this, again, technically is not a mindfulness exercise. It's a kind of meditation, we might say, but it's a way of fostering or experimenting with different emotional states. Now, again, this is not something you can force to happen, but it's sort of like you sort of provide an environment to foster some of these feelings. And again, this is one of those things where the first time you do it, maybe you get nothing, maybe it's profound, maybe it's not for you, maybe you want to keep working on it. But it's just about fostering a sense of compassion, calm with passion, feeling, be able to feel with. So there's self-compassion and compassion for other people. And there are variations, there are a lot of variations on this, but I'll just kind of give you one. By the way, there are some free exercises on my mindfulness, on my website on mindfulness that you can download. And you're welcome to give them your clients if you think they're helpful. There's lots and lots of different resources out there, so you can experience these without trying to memorize them or whatever. So feel free to get those. But here's another one. Again, I'd like to invite you to do. We've got still 20 minutes till the lunch break, and I'm not going to make it last that long. But this is a very useful exercise. In fact, there is a big movement now for compassion-based therapies. And there's wonderful research on that coming out as well. So anyway, it's just a little bit of a taste of a compassion exercise. So let me invite you to do this. So again, find a way that you want to sit and feel free to close your eyes or just kind of lower your eyelids and look down. Keep them open a little bit, especially if you're tired. And again, depending on your background, you may think some of this is silly or you may find this very profound, but whatever your brain does, just kind of notice, oh, that's interesting. My mind thinks it's silly. But if you're willing, just jump in as an experiment just to see what happens. And obviously you can stop at any time. I'm not asking you to do anything too bizarre here. So what I'd like you to do is to bring to mind what for you embodies the ultimate in compassion. What for you would be the ultimate symbol or person, or it could be a divine being? What for you would really embody this is what compassion is. As I said, it could be a religious figure, it could be a symbol, it could be a sense of the entire universe itself. It could be a person you know, it could be a mentor or somebody you admire, living or dead. And once you've decided, I want you to imagine that that person or that symbol is floating up in the sky above you. I mean, maybe just a few feet in front of you and just a little bit above you. And this embodiment of compassion is sort of able to channel all the compassion, all the energy in the universe in the sense that they're not used up. They're the embodiment of this and its unending supply of compassion. And I want you to imagine that compassion overflowing from them and coming toward you. And you can imagine this as a beam of light or as small particles. There are different ways to imagine it, but imagine that this light, this warmth, this energy is coming towards you and it enters in through the top of your head. And as it enters in the top of your head, it just sort of washes you clean. It clears out all the shadows, all the cobwebs, literally lighting you up from the inside. And just see, can you just receive this compassion, this sense of who you are as a person is okay. Who you are right now in this moment is okay. It doesn't mean there aren't things you don't want to change or whatever, but just receive it. You don't have to earn it. You don't have to deserve it. You don't have to perform. Just let it come into your body and sort of fill you up from the inside. And with every breath, it sort of intensifies. Every time you breathe out, the shadows kind of dissolve. Every time you inhale, the energy or the light brightens. And even if there's a party that doesn't believe it, we give that part compassion too. Oh, thank you. You're trying to protect me. You're trying to save me from disappointment, perhaps. Thank you. Don't have to argue or try to fix anything. Just allow it to come in. And then imagine somebody in front of you that could use some of this compassion. Maybe a good friend of yours, maybe your partner, maybe an animal, pet. And I want you to imagine that person a few feet in front of you, a little bit below you, so that the energy is coming in from this being or this symbol, entering into the top of your head. And then it's projected from your heart toward this person. And just imagine them receiving this compassion. This person that you really care about. And, we all have struggles. Maybe they have big struggles or small struggles, but you're just going to send them some of this compassion, this love, or whatever you want to call it. And this doesn't use you up, by the way. You're just a channel. You're not using up part of yourself to help this person. You're just allowing the compassion to flow through you from a universe that has an infinite supply of it. Now, you might stay with the same person that you care about, or maybe a series of faces appear. And you can choose to continue to give this to multiple people that you really care about and you know they could use some compassion. Just imagine sharing. And you can do this silently, or you can imagine wishing them, may you be happy, may you be healthy, may you be free from suffering, or you can come up with your own language. And next, I want you to imagine some people that maybe you don't know that well, or maybe they're just sort of casual acquaintances, but they're human beings too. They need some compassion. I just want you to imagine sending some compassion to them as well. Now, it could be very generic, just a sense of other people in your city or whatever. It could be very specific coworkers that come to mind, but just kind of see what comes up. And just again, you're just sending along this compassion. Now, here's an important point. You can't control whether or not they receive it. For some people, maybe they close themselves off to it or it bounces off, whatever. I just want you to imagine just allowing the energy to flow toward them. And you might imagine that they receive it, but you really can't force that to happen. And next, I want you to imagine now somebody you don't really like that much. Now, this may not be the time to bring up your worst enemy or the person that did horrible things to you, but maybe there's somebody that kind of bothers you a little bit at the office, or a client that's been a little bit of a challenge, or somebody that's caused you some frustration. And want you to see what happens if you do the same thing with them. So here comes all this compassion from this being or this symbol flowing through the universe into your head and then coming out your heart, and just send it toward this person. Now, this is very important. It doesn't mean they um, earned it because of their behavior. Maybe their behavior is horrible. Maybe they've done bad things. You're not condoning any of their behavior. But for the human being within, you just want to share some compassion. Maybe somewhere inside there is something that got miswired in their brain or some bad experience. And we're not here to justify their behavior by any means. You're going to still set boundaries with this person, but can you just send them some compassion as the human being that's inside of there? And if it's really difficult, imagine them as a baby. My guess is right when they came out as a baby, they weren't full of horrible behaviors. Just imagine that smaller baby within if it's too much trouble as they are right now. And then I want you to let that image dissolve of those people. And I want you to just receive some more of this compassion for a little bit before we end. Again, just allowing it to sort of circulate in your own body. You might imagine it coming down your head and going down your back and then down to your toes and then back up the front of your body, sort of a circular pattern perhaps. And then I want you to imagine this being or this symbol that's been floating up above you to sort of merge with your own heart, sort of moving within you. And then as all this imagery dissolves, just imagine that that's still there, still in your own heart. And with that, we're going to let this exercise go now and allow our eyes to come open and bring our attention back to this moment, this place, and this time. And again, feel free to move or stretch if you feel like you need to. And again, I do appreciate the emoji reactions. It helps me recognize that there are people here experiencing these things with me. Yeah, so again, I've I don't push this on anyone. Certainly, it's always an option. I have some clients that love this exercise, some people that really hate it, some people that find it challenging. Um, One thing I bring up, by the way, if somebody does want to do this and they say, I just can't, I'll say, wow, isn't that interesting? If it's hard for you to even imagine receiving compassion, how difficult is it going to be for you to be in a real life relationship where there's going to be a give and take and caring for somebody else if you can never trust or never be comfortable with feeling cared about? So, there are many, many different aspects to this exercise. Another interesting thing I see in this is people say, oh, this was great and I was feeling it. And then you made me think about somebody I don't like. It's almost like those people that say, hey, I want world peace, but not for that guy. There's anger and resentment that gets held on. Now, again, don't misunderstand me. Obviously, we still need to be proactive. We need to set boundaries. We need to take action for certain things. But if I'm holding on to resentments, that person probably doesn't even know I'm doing that, and all it's doing is harming me. Um, so, something to keep in mind. There's a lot of different aspects to this exercise, but uh, if you got something out of that, you can think about whether or not that'd be useful to share with your clients or continue to do with yourself. All right, so we just got a few minutes before the lunch break. And this next one is a really big topic about the neurological mechanisms of mindfulness. But let me get started with it, and then we'll take our lunch break. So again, this is one of those things that's exciting, but I think also gets overused. So I'll be the first to admit that people say, um, oh, it's all about neuroplasticity. Well, that's always been the case. We're not always sure how it happens and the best ways to make it happen, but we're learning more and more and more because the technology is getting cheaper and cheaper. So it's much easier to actually do studies. Um, I'm going to actually show you some brain scans that we did, and you can see some results, but still it's not, when you think about how many connections there are in the human brain, it's just mind-boggling. No pun intended. So there's so much detail that we're still missing, but we're working on it. So this whole idea of neuroplasticity is enduring brain changes, right? And everybody's heard that Hebb's rule, right? Neurons that fire together wire together. And it's very, very much like physical exercise, right? Um, in fact, in a moment, I'm going to talk about how mindfulness literally increases brain volume in certain areas. That sounds stunning at first, but it wouldn't surprise you if I had you do a physical exercise regimen and measured your bicep before and after, and your bicep actually got larger. You'd be like, whoa, um, that probably wouldn't surprise you, but when you really think about it, isn't that stunning that we can change our own physical bodies based on repetition of certain exercises? So this is what we're getting at with experience dependent neuroplasticity. What you do affects your mind. Now, that's one of those common sense things. We're just really starting to see this more and more from a scientific perspective. So, when your brain is exposed or does certain things over time, there will be enduring brain changes. Um, Now, again, there can be limitations to this, but this is such a good news. When I was, doing neuropsych testing and working with people with brain damage, that first year especially is when you're going to see the most in terms of changes, first year or two, and then it slows down. It still happens, but it's a good news that we can start to rewire the brain. And again, limitations, but the best way to do it is through ongoing, often focused repetition of thoughts, behaviors, or feelings. So this is where I keep doing these things. And, we all know things called habits, where I do it often enough, it becomes automatic. Um, Ways of thinking can actually be changed in the mind. Now, we have to be careful with this. If you tell a client, just change your thinking, that can turn into a struggle. And so, but later on, this does actually happen where the way you think is affected. And so we could call this self-directed neuroplasticity. I'm going to choose what I do with my mind, which parts I exercise. Um, that classic Native American folk tale about, we have these two wolves and which one are you going to feed? Um, and so that's very important. How am I spending my time? And if I do have to spend my time doing unpleasant things that are affecting me, can I at least balance it out at other times in my life to sort of stretch my mind, so to speak? All right, so when we come back from our lunch break, we'll go over the questions again. And then we're going to get more depth about the brain mechanisms, and then we'll see where the time is. We'll start getting into more clinical applications. So I apologize. I'm still pretty foundational here, but definitely tomorrow, if not later today, we're going to get really specific on using this with different presenting issues. So, my homework assignment for you, though, is to try to taste your lunch, because very often it happens so automatically you look down and you missed all the taste and all the food. So that's your homework assignment. See if you can taste your lunch, and we'll be back here in an hour and 10 minutes.